Alright, let's go ahead and jump into it. So today we are coming back, we're doing the second part of our sort of advanced encounter building. So if you have not seen part 1, I say go probably watch that first, because I'm probably going to reference quite a bit of stuff in it. And you may not have any idea what I'm talking about. But I'll do a quick recap of what we went over last time, but I don't want to waste too much time because we still have quite a bit to go through. Hopefully you guys are doing alright. I'm doing alright, all things considered. Been a busy couple of weeks, so it's nice to get back to this. Have a little break. Focus on some D&D or TTRPG stuff in general. I mean, anything that we're using in these sort of advanced combat encounter building stuff is going to be useful for probably whatever, let's say, as I'm calling sort of action RPGs, anything that's an RPG that's mainly about sort of fighting monsters or bad guys of any nature, and not something that's more investigation or social heavy, like Amber or Call of Cthulhu or etc. But these are games that we're looking at that are more focused on specifically fighting, right? Combat's a major part of the game, if not the most important part of the game. So let's go ahead and hop in. Let me move it over so you guys can see exactly what I'm looking at. Here we go. Let's pull up the workspace. Alright, there we go. So, here are the 5 levels we talked about. And we went through basically the first 2 levels. We took a lot of time, which is understandable. Those are going to be the most complicated and sort of like the foundational knowledge to sort of build us up on these last 3 that master, the Paragon, and the God tier sort of levels. So let's just do a quick recap. You know, the who, what, when, where, why, how, who this is for. Primarily, this is going to be for, you know, people who have been running Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder or even OSE or some other OSR game for a while, right? You've probably run a few adventures in it, probably maybe published stuff, or maybe you're trying to do some homebrew stuff and you're getting kind of stymied because you're like, you keep kind of smashing your head against the wall trying to figure out, you know, why combat encounters aren't quite going the way they want to go. So the first thing we kind of talk about is that CR, adventure tiers, and action economy. And these are really, really important. First, a bit of information you're going to come across when you start looking at like how to build better encounters, specifically combat encounters. They're going to point you at CR and action economy, especially for 5th edition. So yeah, those are important, but this is kind of delves into, in that video, I kind of delve into why each is important. And mainly it's sort of about action economy and adventure tiers. The adventure tiers are those bands of levels, so 1 through 4, 5 through 10, 11 through 16, and then 17 through 20. And so when you have monsters that are built to play within those adventure tiers, things get really, really wonky in combats if you use monsters from a different adventure tier than what the players are in, because it kind of screws up the action economy, even if you try to fix the action economy with the number of creatures, right? That's why solo encounters sometimes don't come off very well, because you might have to use a bigger, badder monster from a different adventure tier than what the players are in, and why sometimes running like those really sort of like horde kind of combats don't seem to be very fulfilling, because you're running, you know, characters are in this adventure tier and you're using monsters that are from this adventure tier or even, you know, way down here. That's really it. The second part is, of course, monster strategy. Keith Hammond's The Monsters Know What They're Doing series is blogs and then books has been wildly successful, especially for newer DMs kind of coming in. And it's about taking a look at the monster stamp block, seeing what they can do, seeing what they have at their disposal, and then sort of putting them in a position to be effective and win in combats. We use, last time we kind of used a standard example of a sort of bugbear ambush. We kind of use that throughout a lot of our things that we're showing examples with, and that was one of the big ones, right? They get an ambusher trait that is very much like rogue sneak attack, so they want to basically ambush parties, throw javelins, run away, try to ambush them again. They really don't want to go toe-to-toe whenever possible, and if they are going to do that, they're going to try to avoid fighting, you know, the paladin and plate mail and look for those squishier spellcasters or even clerics, things of that nature that have very destructive magic and often don't have a lot of armor on. They're very squishy, they're very easy to hit with weapons. So that's what they're kind of focused on. And so kind of playing them to that effect. The last thing we kind of talked about in that apprentice level was non-death resolution. So expanding the ability of how to end the combats, because in a lot of times, especially in new DMs, especially if you're running a lot of published modules, they kind of assume that the players are just going to kill all the monsters, and all the monsters are going to fight till they reach 0 HP. And so this kind of starts talking about things like, oh, they're going to run away, oh, they're going to try to parlay, or they're going to try to capture player characters, and why they would do those things, and things like that. And that will tie into, actually, this non-death resolution ties directly into, this is why it's important to watch kind of the previous video, it's going to tie directly into this 4th bullet point at the veteran level, which is monster motivation. So, if you are, say, you're running some sort of like bestial creature that has sort of an animal-like intelligence, there's not a lot of reasons why they're not going to like capture and try to ransom player characters. So that doesn't really work for a non-death resolution. But if you're invading their lair, their real motivation is probably just to get you out of their lair, right? Because you're a dangerous home intruder, basically. And then their prerogative is not killing the PCs, it's about getting them out of the lair. And so whatever means possible. So they're just trying to scare you off. So outside of monster motivation, let's say environmental use, right? We're talking about using terrain, dimensions, elevation, light, and concealment. And how to make the environment very important to the arena of combat. And I use that term a lot, arenas. It is a game at the end of the day. I mean, we can kind of beat around the bush, but in the end we are just sort of making set piece areas for combats to fight in. Same way in a video game when you walk into like a suspiciously large room and you're like, okay, well, there's probably going to be a combat in here, right? There's going to be some sort of combat that happens. Same sort of thing. But making sure that those arenas are more than just sort of a backdrop. So being able to use the terrain, controlling movement, elevation for 3D combat, which can, if you're new, that's probably the last one I would probably mess with, because adding the 3rd dimension to combat can be very interesting, whether that's underwater or flying or just platforms and climbing. It acts as an extra half, right? You're usually working in 2D, so if you add another 50% of things that you have to keep track of, because you're keeping track of up and down that Z-axis now. But in addition, we're going to look at things like light, because dark vision probably doesn't work the way that you think it does, or your players think that it does. Using light and using concealment, what used to be called obscurement. So mist and cover and things like that can either make combat very, very easy or very, very difficult, and can sort of pinpoint advantages and disadvantages for different types of player characters and different types of monsters. So if you have a sort of melee-based PC, maybe you have a very melee-based party, and you kind of want to make something that's kind of difficult for them. You give them a lot of difficult terrain to move over. You add that elevation without an easy way for them to sort of scale, and you put some, archers up on basically a parapet shooting down at them, and then you have a bunch of melee characters that kind of have to do a lot of extra work to get to them to be able to do the things that they need to do to be successful in combat. So things like that. Monster pick and mix, talking about creating teams of monsters that have a bit of symbiosis and have symbiosis with an arena, just like we're talking about. So if you want to find the cave system that has really, really bad darkness, doesn't have any sort of ambient light, and maybe has, whipping winds that come through that maybe put out player character torches or something like that, so they know that this is like a hazard in the dungeon. And then you want to mix that with something like Grimlocks. They have blind sight, so they don't need torches, and they can kind of ambush on the party and attack, and there can be times when you're fighting where the lights go out, and then a player character has to stop what they're doing to sort of turn the lights back on. Things like that, which can be really fun, and can add a new level of difficulty or a new level of challenge to a combat that's not straightforward. More guys with more AC, more hit points, better saves. That's what we're looking at trying to accomplish. After that, we have variable difficulty. It's the importance of not having just a set difficulty for encounters as you go through, where everything's a medium to hard encounter, medium to hard encounter, medium hard to encounter, medium to hard encounter. I talk about this as cupcakes and sledgehammers, a very easy combat, also matched with a very, very hard combat. And having those jump spikes back and forth between difficulties, so there are times where the players get to feel really great because they come in and they curb stomp enemies, and then every once in a while there's a big fight that kind of puts them on the ropes. Kind of keep them unsettled as to being able to really get a good gauge of what's coming next. Keep them guessing, sort of. And like we said, that we already kind of talked about monster motivation. Determining what the monsters want out of a combat. So if you have humanoid monsters, they're more likely to talk. They might try to parlay, they might try to bribe, they might try to intimidate. You might get to a point where they want to grab PCs and they just want their gear, because they have gear that's worth money and or magic items that are very powerful that they want. Things of that nature. Because monster motivation is rarely killed player characters, in general. Sometimes it is. Especially if you have like some sort of subplot, either for a specific player character or for the group that's hired assassins or something like that. Well, the motivation is kind of kill the PCs. But it could also be money. Professional assassins don't kill for nothing, right? They kill for money. So if you can maybe bribe them or something like that, fake your own death, etc. with their help, those are ways to sort of get around that. It can provide for a little bit more nuanced encounters and more ways that you can have those non-death resolutions that we're talking about. Those sorts of things that you can do. So let's go ahead and jump on. So those are sort of the first two levels that you want to look at sort of changing when you're coming right out the gate as sort of a newer DM. Of course, if you guys have any questions about any of that, make sure to drop it down in the chat and I'll take a look at them as I can. Alright, so the first one I want to talk about in sort of the master level is, and this kind of ties in with variable difficulty, is death by 1,000 cuts. So what do I mean by that? So this is more, I think, common in OSR rules and that understanding of the game, and not very prevalent in today's sort of modern incarnations of D&D, Pathfinder, action-based games. Is that at the end of the day, no matter how we want to splice it, we can call D&D or whatever your preferred game a collaborative storytelling game, and that's not a wrong description of what something like D&D is. It's a resource management game. It's about managing your hit points, your spell slots, your abilities, your food, your ammunition, your time. That is what the game is really about. It's about managing those separate pools of resources so you can be successful as an adventurer and successful as a party. And sometimes that gets lost, especially in the combat encounter building phase, because we think about that and we're like, okay, monsters and player character party, these things should be equal in power and equal in the way they hit each other to make a very balanced sort of combat. Ideally, kind of what we kind of strive for in general, especially as a sort of a foundation. But it's important to remember that the monsters only basically have this one combat, not only in their day, but as far as what we're kind of in the narrative, in their life. This will be the combat, this will be the defining moment of in which they will probably die, but might not die. But this will be the only fight. For our player characters, this might be the first fight of the day. It might be the 5th fight of the day. The idea is it's death by 1,000 cuts because you wear them down with resources over time. That's when you look in things like the DMG and it's like, oh, you should be having, I don't even remember what it says. They always have some wild number, like 8 encounters in a day or something like that. Any new GM that looks at that, or any new, even experienced Dungeon Masters that look at that and they're like, 8? That's a ton. Well, that's because they don't all need to be knockout, drag out, big fights. It's important to have those cupcakes. It's important to have relatively easy things, and to remember that your job is to sort of wear them down. That's what things makes for more compelling, more thrilling games. It's not one big fight. That's why the solo encounters rarely work. Right? We talked about the alpha striking and the importance of the sludge hammers and cupcakes. Again, go watch that video. Everything of this is really, really tied together, so it's really helpful if you have that foundational knowledge for it. So the idea is that it's not one big fight, because toe-to-toe, the player characters are way, way outpowered than whatever monster is considered to be equivalent for them. They have so many more resources at their disposal. with the exception of perhaps, especially in 5e spellcasters, who always end up having a ton of spell slots and always die before using like half of them. That's a problem. But that's because the designers are sort of attaching player level kind of resources to a monster, and that's why that doesn't work correctly. That's why it feels off, why it feels like the spellcasters have such a hard time getting off a lot of their spells. Because we know the action economy, we know that most combats are going to last somewhere between 3 to 5 rounds. That's what the spellcaster gets 5 casts off. Maybe like 7 if they have some bonus action spells that they can use, or twin spell, or quicken spell, something like that. We can do some extra stuff. But yeah, as spellcasting, because especially in 5e, even in Pathfinder, even something like Pathfinder 2e, like you are very constricted as a DM for your monsters, the amount of actions that monster has, and the way that spells are cast, especially in 5e or even Pathfinder 2e, something like that. You can't just be boom, 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 throwing out spells. By the rules of the game. I mean, you're the DM, you can do whatever you want. And sometimes this is worthwhile to be like, yeah, you could just cast another spell. It'd be easy to just take maybe a lower level monster out of that encounter, and just be like, the spellcaster basically gets 2 turns of actions in a combat round. There we go. Just to give them the ability to be able to do more cool magic stuff, to make the encounter more difficult. Those are sort of things. But the death by 1,000 cuts is ties in with the monster motivation and the variable difficulty. It's having monsters doing very specific things. We talked about this in the previous one, about having that overnight encounter, those random encounters, while resting. And players like, oh, we got attacked by goblins again. And then they have to get up and they kill some goblins, which is usually not a very difficult fight, depending on what level your party is. And then they go back to sleep. And they're like, okay, well, why did we have that encounter? But if we switch that and make the monster motivation different, now the monster motivations, the goblins are trying to steal their stuff. They're not here to kill the player characters. They understand threat assessment levels, right? They understand that these are very powerful, to their eyes, monsters. Right, so they're not trying to go toe-to-toe with a adventuring party. They're trying to get in there, steal their stuff, and get out of there, and assumes that whoever's on watch, or somebody else who's asleep, will eventually wake up to their stuff being stolen, and now there's a totally different encounter where they have to sort of chase down goblins to try to get their stuff back. And God forbid, the goblins end up stealing their bag of holding or something, which of course every party shoves everything they own in one bag, which can be easily stolen off of them at any point. And again, that's not a punitive thing. I'm not trying to punish the players. I'm just trying to play the monsters how I think the monsters would maybe act in this sort of encounter. They know that adventurers have very useful, very valuable things, so they would try to steal them. And so that's death by 1,000 cuts. You can do skirmishes, hidden runs, just like we talked about with the bugbear encounter. Having an encounter where the bugbears pop out, they get their surprise attack with their javelins, and then they just go away. They're not trying to go toe-to-toe. And then you have the player characters like, oh, well, we took some hit point damage. We're going to either use some healing spells, we're going to take a short rest and use some hit dice, or we're going to keep pushing into the next encounter with reduced hit points. That's the death by 1,000 cuts, because you're slowly sort of chipping away at them. So if you want to think about it as sort of if you're trying to create an adventure, and you think about the adventure in a way that a sculptor might look at a piece of marble and they're like, I'm trying to bring out the thrilling adventure that's within this weird lump of structure. So we do that by chipping away at it, chipping away, and then as players get towards the middle, towards the end of the combat, or the end of the adventure, and they're like, oh, I'm running out of resources, things are really tough, there's tons of monsters, it feels like we can't ever take a rest. It's really hard to take rests and recuperate things. We've taken like 2 short rests. I'm got very few hit dice left. If we take another rest, we really need to take a long rest. But we're in a dungeon. We know DM's very clear about if we take a rest in the dungeon, it's highly likely that monsters are going to find us in their dungeon, and then we're not going to get the long rest, and we're going to have another fight that doesn't progress us in the adventure. That's the sort of things that we're looking at death by 1,000 cuts. And so it's not important that we have 3 big toe-to-toe square-off hour-long combats. It's more about, well, what if we had, 7 combats that were, 15 minutes long? What if we tried that? Monsters come in, they do some damage, player characters kill them or drive them off. Maybe they go warn other ones, they come back with reinforcements a few minutes later while they're trying to take a short rest, or they're looting bodies or whatever because they didn't set watch to make sure that those guys weren't going to come back. And so just kind of continually harrying them and doing these hit and run actions, taking away at their resources, especially when you're looking at chipping away at resources that aren't necessarily hit points. Because hit points is the resource that most player characters, especially in 5th edition, have the most of. So that's not, when they're like, oh, you know, I took 5 points of damage, but, you know, I have 50 hit points, that's not that big of a deal. To the point where they're not even going to be like, well, I'm not going to stop for a short rest because I didn't do anything. And if you have these small encounters, you want to put them in a position where the players need to sort of make a choice when the encounter starts, or basically in the first round of encounter. And I know that I do this as a player, and I'm sure plenty of you do this as a player as well. When you look at an encounter, and the encounter's kicking off, and you're looking at the monsters on the field, and you're looking at your player characters, and you're like, I'm trying to figure out how strong these monsters are. And if I'm a spellcaster, I'm trying to think of, do I want to use leveled spells in this encounter? Is it worth spell slots? Or is it worth taking maybe some extra hit point damage and saving those very crucial, very valuable resource of spell slots for something else, and just scoring with my cantrips? That's the sort of decision that's going to make it very much more engaging combat for your players, if they have to make decisions like that. Like I said, if you have those sort of setouts and you're like, we're doing 3 big fights for the adventure, they already know that they need to use spell slots in those encounters. They're going to know that. But if you start hitting them with smaller encounters, and they're like, well, I've only got this many hit dice left, and I've got this many spell slots left, is it more useful for me to use an AoE ability to make your paladins go, well, I could use Smite in this situation, we could just probably end this encounter pretty quickly if I did that, if I use one of my Smites. Make them have those choices, trying to make them have to make a choice about what sort of resource they want to use to get through this encounter, basically. Whether that's going to be hit points and hit dice, or it's going to be other sort of abilities, especially magic item abilities and magic spell slot abilities. Those can be really, really big sort of difference makers. Was there anything else I want to say about Death by a Thousand Cuts? That's most of it. And that's something it took me a very long time to learn as sort of a dungeon master. I got reinvigorated in the hobby through 4th edition, which really had a focus on sort of those big set-piece combats. And then you realize that sometimes that's really unfulfilling. I talked about a previous example of a TPK on a very, very easy encounter when I was talking about sort of the cupcakes and sledgehammers in the Team Arena Symbiosis. Is that you can actually TPK like a party with a relatively easy combat if they're not playing very smartly. So in that example, it was a relatively easy combat encounter, but they focused on the wrong things, and they weren't using their abilities to take care of what the main threat was. So as they saw this sort of, they clocked it as a relatively easy combat. And so they didn't want to use a lot of their high-level abilities, and in the end they ended up paying for it with their lives, which is not necessarily what you want, but it is something, it does reaffirm for the players that, hey, this is a dangerous place, that even easy encounters have the ability to be life-threatening if you don't play smart, if you aren't acting like your life is on the line. Your life is on the line. You want the players to play their characters like every time that they get into combat, and when they choose to use combat, is a life-threatening situation for everybody involved. Unless you're doing like you could always be doing like a combat, like a public combat arena or a knuckle boxing match, something like that. But those are different. Those are contests, right? Those aren't really fights. It's not really a threat that somebody's going to get killed there unless you're doing some sort of weird subterfuge plot line where you're trying to, like we said, those assassins, maybe that's assassins in the arena with them and pulls out a poison dagger or something and stabs them. That's different. Okay, let's go on to our next one then. So we did Death by a Thousand Cuts. Let's do alternative party / player character objectives. What are those? So just as we talked about with monster motivations, it's the same thing except we're looking at the party side. We're looking at the player side. It's creating combat encounters where necessarily or situations in a combat where reducing a monster to 0 hit points isn't necessarily the primary objective. So you might go, all right, so what could the primary objective be if it's not that? It could be a lot of things. Sometimes they do this in published adventures, not always, where the climactic sort of scene encounter doesn't necessarily, their objective is not necessarily to kill somebody. And the thing that comes immediately to mind is like the dark rituals, like doing the cult dark ritual storyline, where they're conducting a ritual, and really your objective is to make sure they don't complete the ritual, not necessarily to kill the head cultist or whatever. Because you could still kill the head cultist, but if the cult members are able to finish their rite and summon their demons or eldritch horrors or whatever their cult is about. This is sometimes what I call sort of like Majora's masking the sort of adventure. Compare it to something like Ocarina of Time, where it's very clear that you need to stop Ganon or Ganondorf. Well, Majora's Mask is a little bit different. You're trying to stop the moon from crashing into the world, and you can't kill the moon. There's no amount of bow shots and sword strikes that are going to kill the moon and stop it from crashing into the world. So, right, there's some sort of different objective that's going on. Another way to do this is, and you have to be very clear when you set up an encounter like this, if you want to do an overwhelming forces encounter, you have to make it clear that as DM, I'm going to throw a bunch of low-level monsters, mobs at you. And there's an insurmountable number of them. That no matter how many you cleave through, there are always going to be more coming. If you want to set up an adventure where maybe there's an open portal that monsters are spewing out of, very sort of Gauntlet-style video game, old Gauntlet style, you're like, alright, well, the objective now is to maybe, like, seal up this place so they don't get out, or close the portal. It's not kill the individual monsters, because killing each individual monster does not actually get them any closer to the objective of stopping the danger. Something like that. There's not a ton to this point. It's because it's very specifically situational. But rituals, portals, things like that are very common ways to add these to adventures. I do think that you have to be kind of careful with this. If it's not a very straightforward stop the dark ritual, it can be very difficult to sort of get players at the table to grok in their head that the objective is not kill all the bad guys, because that's sort of the default assumption for most combat-heavy role-playing games. Is there's a bad guy, go kill the bad guy. They can default to that or forget that, hey, that's actually not the objective, that's not your mission here. It's not going to stop the thing. You need to give them a lot of reminders often, I find. Say, hey, you guys are just kind of wasting, we talked about, right, death by 1,000 cuts, you guys are wasting a bunch of resources, not progressing the adventure. And this is one of those things where death of the 1,000 cuts moves in with something like, talk about, once it's clear the momentum of sort of who's going to win the fight, it's okay to sort of just wrap up a fight. And so if you're doing the death by 1,000 cuts and they're getting sidetracked by all the like mobs and ads on the side, you can very quickly be like, oh yeah, you cleared this out, you take a few more hit points of damage, in a very heavy, almost heavy-handed narration style, be like, well, you cleared out this little group of monsters, but you see more are coming through the portal, like until you stop the portal, it seems like just anything that you kill will be replaced twofold. Make it very clear that no solution to this is hacking through enemies. There's something else that needs to go on. Oh, another really fun one. I ran this, but the player characters ended up not doing what I thought they were going to do. Is I ran an adventure where there was a very high level sort of construct guardian in this tomb or whatever it was. They got into a toe-to-toe fight with it. It hit them a couple times. They were like, oh, well, we definitely can't fight this thing head on. The idea is that there was sort of like a clockwork mechanism on its back, and the idea is that they were supposed to sort of distract the creature so one of them could sort of climb up on its back and sort of fiddle with it and get it to stop. They ended up running away, and because that wasn't the primary mission of what they were doing, they did the important thing. They were smarter than me, and they were like, alright, well, let's just not deal with this threat. It's slow, it's lumbering, it's not very good at seeking us out. We'll just run around it, and we'll hide and look for artifact, I think it was, that they were recovering. So that's always open to it too. But they were always a threat, like, hey, this thing is lumbering. It has no purpose except to protect this tomb. It will eventually catch up to you. It plays by very sort of like 80s horror slasher rules. It's like, you can run, but Jason's always gonna catch up to you, in that idea. So it uses that idea, and the idea that you don't want to be in combat with this thing because it punches way above your weight. You are fighting a very, very difficult monster if you fight this thing, so don't fight it. And that really ties into the next point, and we'll do that. So hitting the PCs where it hurts. So once you get to this master level, we talked about earlier the death by 1,000 cuts. We talk about it in sort of variable difficulty. We talk about it in the monster pick and mix. This concept, as I said before, is that hit points is considered sort of the primary resource for player characters. But it's also the one that they have the most of, and the one that's easiest for them to replace. So hitting the PCs where it hurts is talking about hitting them with some sort of penalty, some sort of negative aspect of the fight that's not you just take hit point damage. We talked about this last time with those CR1 shadows that do strength damage. So stat damage, and I have custom augmented monsters that when they hit you, instead of dealing direct damage, they do hit dice depletion, where every time they hit you, they take away one of your hit dice, which is something, remember, especially in 5e, you don't get all your hit dice back when you take a long rest, but you do get all your hit points back. And so taking away their ability to heal on the run is really, really damaging. Is in a lot of ways worth a lot more than the equivalent number of hit points you might take away. It's almost 2 to 3 times more severe. So you could get hit for and lose a D10, a hit die, and that's actually more potent than hitting a character for like 20 hit points. I mean, unless they're like first level. Either way, that's going to be a bad time for them. It stops characters from being able to heal themselves up in between combats, and that ties right into death by 1,000 cuts and the resource management aspect of the game. So you start whittling away at non-hit point resources, players are going to start to freak out a little bit. Sometimes I'll have traps or hazards that do spell slot eating. It does 2 really cool things. So if you do some sort of trap or hazard that instead sort of sucks the latent magical energy out of a player character, and they send their wizard up to sort of deal with it because it's a magical trap or whatever, and it sucks a couple of spell slots out of them, they're not going to be happy about it, and then they're also going to be like, I'm not going to go back in there. It is also a very cool way for if you have a martial character that has Arcana or has some way to maybe deal with that trap, and they can walk into it basically unmolested, unharmed, right? Because they don't have any spell slots to eat. But if they have enough Arcana knowledge, they can disable the trap, and then it's a cool way to sort of highlight a martial character for having an ability, or having the knowledge of something that's sort of outside of what you would consider most thieves or fighters to have. It kind of highlights them in a cool way, and be like, oh, maybe spellcasters aren't super powerful. If there's a very simple trap, they can really, really deplete their ability to do anything very simply. Other things, conditions are a big one. Anytime you can try to throw conditions on player characters is really nice. It really kind of upends sort of what they can do, whether that's exhaustion levels. We talk about that. Exhaustion levels are usually the go-to ones, but there's also conditions, blinded, charmed, frightened, those sorts of things that can make players do the thing that we want them to do, which is to make players have to think on their feet about and not do sort of their standard operating procedure, most effective thing that they do every combat. So anytime you can sort of kick them out of that rhythm, it's really, really good. That's really what all this sort of advanced encounter building is about. It's about knocking the players off balance for their characters, giving them opportunities to shine, obviously, but also to knock them out of things that they take for granted. Like the spell slotting, the ability to be like, I have this many spell slots per day, and then run into a trap that removes that number, and now they have to readjust and rethink things. Those sorts of things. So keep that in mind. Or gear's a good one. I had a very fun, I'm gonna say hazard. It was a dwarven stronghold in a mountain. The front door of which was completely rimed over, had rime ice completely over it. And so I was not expecting them to walk in through that. That was not supposed to be the first room of the dungeon. So I set the DC for getting in there very high. I believe it was like a 22 strength check to try to break through the ice and open the front door. If you attach a number to it, it can happen, and sometimes you gotta roll with that. Sure, I could have been like, no, it doesn't open, but that's not fun. They rolled really high, they kicked in the door, they ran directly into what is sort of like the Great Hall of this Dwarven Hold, which has a magical enchantment on it, but the magical enchantment's all wonky now, it doesn't work correct. And so what's supposed to happen is they're supposed to, as soon as they step on sort of like this mosaic, like, welcome space inside the front door that's sort of like a entryway, is that it's going to depress, and then that brings the magical effect to life. So what's supposed to happen is they step on it, it says, like, welcome friends or whatever, and it depresses, and what it does is that it magically rips all their armor and weapons and gear off of them and stores them in a cupboard off to the side. And then it's supposed to set one of the tables with plates and flatware and cups, and supposed to bring out food and drink for them to show hospitality, right? That's the way that it's supposed to work. But this is very old, the magic's gone real wonky. So that part works. They can try to make a strength check to kind of hold their stuff onto them, which they ended up failing. So it took all their gear, ripped all their armor off of it, and threw it up into this cupboard. And the cupboard's placed high up on the wall. The idea being that you put all the arms and armor away from people, so if anybody actually under your roof actually gets angry about something, or some sort of fight breaks out, that nobody pulls a knife and stabs somebody, right? The worst they can do is lump each other over the head with their fists. And so that's what's supposed to happen. So it pulls them up into this cupboard, and now their cupboard's like up on the wall, and they have to figure out how to get their gear back. But the enchantment for the table setting's not right, so it starts pelting them with rotted fruit and moldy bread and chargers and dinner plates and goblets and flagons and stuff. And so they're just like taking cover as things like smack them around, and then everything drops to the ground and goes back to dead silence. But that's a fun way to be like, okay, but I'm just going to... There was an encounter that ends up happening in there, but there could have been. They just didn't roll for the random encounter in that room. But now they're like without their stuff, and they have to go get their stuff. So that's... Right, we're talking about a different objective, something else that's kind of going on, even though it's not a combat encounter. And it very well introduces them to the idea that, hey, there's magic in here, there's automation in this, because there's a lot of automation in that dungeon. And the automation's not working correctly, so keep your head on a swivel. Like I said, that was supposed to be more of a mid-dungeon room, but that's where they went up, so they basically had an idea to go one way or the other and make that decision. That's a fun way to just kind of remind players that hit point damage is not the only damage that encounters can do to you. So I had a little sub point down here is that this becomes relatively important the higher level you play, especially in D&D 5th edition. Because at higher levels, especially martial characters, have so many hit points. They have so many hit points that hit point damage no longer really isn't a concern most of the time. How many times have you played a high level martial character? You've been sitting there and the DM's like, well, this guy hit you for 23 points of slashing damage, and you're like, alright, cool, I still have 57 points of hit points. It's like, yeah, that's almost a third of my hit points, but eh. So when you reach that place where being hit, even with a pretty decent attack, doesn't sort of evoke a reaction from players, especially in the beginnings of a fight, you want to look at maybe, this when you start mixing in, maybe there's some other resources I can start targeting. This is one of the reasons on the PC side, this exact reason is why people really love heat metal. Right, because heat metal is used on bad guys, there's not really a save, and now they're like, oh, well, my armor's running me, or I have to drop my sword because it's, white hot. So it takes away their ability to fight. You can do the same thing to PCs, like, it can almost be really demoralizing. If you look at something like a paladin, and you're like, yeah, I'm gonna do heat metal on the paladin. Because why wouldn't you? You're talking about then, you're a big, beefy, defendery kind of player. They have a ton of hit points. They're encased in plate armor. They've got a big shield. They've got a big, probably sword or axe or mace or whatever. And it's like, if you can just heat metal them heat metal that on them and take away that shield, take away their weapon, that's really devastating. That could be really devastating, very demoralizing. So you don't want to do it too much. At least that you don't want to go back to the very specific wells too many times. Like if you have two combats in a row where you do the same heat metal trick on the paladin, they're not going to be very happy with the play experience. But if you mix it around to different people, different player characters, and you mix around, you know, what sort of things you're targeting. Okay, this time I targeted gear, and this time I'm going to target hit dice, this time I'm going to target some poison conditions or something like that. You can mix it up, and every combat encounter is going to feel very different, very nuanced. And we're going to put them back in that position of that death by 1,000 cuts that I talked about, where you have players at the start of the combat being like, should I use a spell here? Should I use one of my high-level abilities here? I know it's not a huge fight, but if it's going to keep us from taking on, you know, a curse, a disease, a poison, losing my weapon, losing some sort of gear, losing my spell slots through some other means, it's better to use those spell slots and get something from it. So maybe I should just use a spell right now and we can just chew through this combat and try to get through this combat before, you know, that general sort of 3 to 5 rounds. If we can chew through this combat in 2 rounds and we don't have to use hit dice and we save some of our other abilities, then that might be worth it. So that's already making a very much more engaging experience for combat for players. Keep them on their toes thinking about what they should be doing. And let's see. The last one we sort of have at this master level is... I have a very long name for this, but I'm just going to use a short name. Facilitate clever play ideas. The actual title that I have down in my notes is Facilitate clever / non-standard ways for players to do damage or shift a combat in their favor. So this kind of goes exactly along with what I said about that standard operating procedure. You have players that step in and they tend to do the same things over and over again. And especially for martial characters, you have players that say, oh, I'm really bored with the combat, or you have DMs, Dungeon Masters or Game Masters online, who talk about, oh, it's so hard, it's so boring, like our fights are so boring, our combats are really boring because the players always do the same thing over and over again, or they're, you know, running roughshod over my monsters, or they seem really underpowered, or which way that needle is flying back and forth at. And one of the things that I find really, really helpful is facilitating clever play ideas. And this is something that I came to as a more experienced player that I kind of gravitated towards naturally. From my experience, this can be a very... It's weird to call it like some sort of like weird social test for a Dungeon Master, but it is kind of what it is. It's not necessarily like I'm doing secret tests on Dungeon Master when I'm playing with them, but more like I'm trying to get a gauge of sort of how they operate as a Dungeon Master. And that's if they're going to facilitate a clever play idea. So this is when... The obvious example is when you're like, oh, well, I want to use this very specific spell, and I want to use it in a very non-standard way, and how the DM or GM is going to work with you to like, oh, well, I'm going to help you try to figure out a way to try to get what you're trying to do, or try to explain why I don't think that that's going to work, rather than just saying yes or no. And so one of the things that you'll find, when people say that playing a basic fighter is really, really boring, is because, I mean, they don't do this part, is they're generally not engaging with clever play. And you can tell a DM when a DM gets really surprised by this when somebody does it as a player. I was playing in a pickup random online game during COVID. We, in fact, were not playing D&D. We were playing, I think Dungeon World. And we were running up to this crone's, house, probably a hag. And there were it's in a swamp, and there were some alligators outside. And it was like, what do you want to do? And they were like this big bubbling cauldron of noxious chemicals. And I was like, well, I want to run over there and see if I can kick over that cauldron so it spills all over the alligator. And they're like, oh, okay. You don't just want to hit it with a spell? You don't want to run up and hit it with a weapon? No, I want to kick over this giant brew of caustic chemicals all over it. And so if you have a Dungeon Master that's like, yes, absolutely, let's figure out how that does. One of the things that I think really makes the difference here for a Dungeon Master is that you want to reward clever play. If you like that, right? You want them to do non-standard kind of stuff, then you need to reward that positively. Because the worst thing you can do, I'll give you a bad example that I have from a real game, and then we'll kind of talk about a hypothetical good example, I guess, or the way that I try to adjudicate that sort of stuff. First one, playing a Pathfinder 2e game, and we're attacking this guy in the sort of like thieves' den hideout, and the big bad guy is in the library. That's where we catch up to him. He's in his own sort of like personal study library, so there's a bunch of bookshelves around. And we basically, the way the room operates is we walk in through a door, there's a bookshelf on one side, there's a wall on the other side, so it's kind of a tunnel, and you have to like go around the bookshelf to get into the room. Well, he's waiting for us on the other side of the bookshelf, the fight breaks out, and most of us are on the other side of the bookshelf, so we can't really see the big bad guy, so it's kind of 1-to-1 until they can sort of clear some space to allow the rest of us into the room. So we're in this position, and my character is looking at the situation, is like, I'm playing a rogue, and I'm like, there's nothing I can do here. And I talked to him, it's like, can I see through the bookshelves? No, the bookshelves have a backing, you can't see through them. Okay. Can I push the bookshelf over on him? I thought, oh, that's a clever play, right? That's very iconic library cinematic scene where bookshelves start falling over. I was like, that'd be a cool thing to do. He's like, no, they're bolted to the ground. I was like, all right. That's a little weird. But I also didn't know why he was stopping me, so I was like, oh, okay. Well, I guess I hang out here for my turn, because I can't really do anything, and I can't get to a position where I can even see this guy to attack him. So I guess I sit here for my turn. And I was like, that was like for me, it was a really missed opportunity. That could have been a really cool thing, I mean, he was a big tough guy. Let's say that he gets a strength save to be like, oh, or what is a fortitude save in Pathfinder 2e, to not get pinned under the bookshelf or whatever, and he takes a little bit of damage, it's no big deal, and now people can get into the room, but to get shut down like that from a game master is really, really demoralizing as a player. You go, oh, I guess I can't do anything fun or interesting with this game. So for me, I'm not going to dig it out, but in my DM's binder, I have a modified version of the 5e DMG's improvised damage. And I don't even remember what page it's on, but it has a little table that's by basically level improvised damage, when you just have a situation where somebody's trying to do damage to something, and you need to adjudicate sort of like how much damage that should be. So I use a modified version of that table. Like I said, it's a whole table for each level, so I just boiled it down to an algorithm that's kind of the same. Basically, it's just X is equal to party level. So it scales. The idea is that we want to reward them by doing more damage than they might normally do with their action. That's going to be the big difference, if they're trying to do a damaging thing, or is going to set up something that lets them have some sort of massive advantage. That's when we start using like the conditions. What kind of conditions can I throw on the bad guy that this makes sense with? Like if you're fighting in a room of humans, like human opponents, and you're playing as a party that everybody has dark vision or other sort of extrasensory, different types of perception, be like, well, I snuffed the candles in the room or whatever, so now we're fighting at an advantage, something like that. So, but this is how it goes. So this is basically, one target, and I think this is it might actually be under the traps rules in the 5e DMG. It's one of the actual useful tables in the DMG for 5e. And it works very simply. It's just XD10, where X is the party level. So if you're a first level party, whatever sort of clever thing you're trying to do, whether that's push over the bookshelf, if it's only targeting one creature, it's 1d10 plus 1. If you were like, I'm going to make a trap that's sort of like a fire, like a dragon's breath fire kind of trap, you can go, oh, well, they're 4th level, so it does 46 plus 4 damage to whoever gets caught in it, and then half damage to whoever saves. Very simple to do that. Very kind of appropriately leveled the party's level. So it's never going to do way too much damage, but it's not going to be so little damage to be kind of not worth doing. That nobody's going to pay attention to it. Multiple targets, this is not going to be enough damage to, assuming somebody's at relatively close to full hit points, it's not going to knock anybody unconscious. But one target, depending on what character it is, because it does a d10. So if it's a wizard or somebody that gets hit like that has a d6 hit die, there's a good chance that it might just KO them in one shot, which is good. There are a lot of people that might say that's bad, But that's good. Like, traps and hazards should feel life-threatening. If they're going to do damage, if they're that type of trap. There are different types of traps. If it's a trap that's specifically deals damage, it should be a trap that feels like it could have killed you. It's unlikely to just, in one shot, absolutely kill a character, unless the character basically had no hit points when they got hit with it, which is pretty rare for a player character to be exploring a dungeon with like single-digit hit points, especially if they're at higher level. That's pretty unlikely, especially to be the person who gets hit with that one target. So it's unlikely to just outright kill them, but it is enough to usually maybe KO somebody, and so it feels like it was a very aggressive trap, right? It feels like it was a life-threatening trap, even though in reality it's really not that life-threatening, but it feels like it at the table. When you have a character that has, 40 hit points and you're rolling 6 or 7 d10 because they're at like half hit points, and then they get KO'd, they're like, oh crap. And then it talks about that resource management. We are death by 1,000 cuts. They've got to heal up from that. Are they going to use potions? That's another resource. Are they going to use spells? That's a resource. Are they going to take a short rest? That's a resource. And they spend more hit dice. It's very similar. And so facilitate clever play ideas. We talked about that environmental use when you're using those terrains, dimensions, and stuff. And you can do this for the bad guys too. Is to showcase how either side can use what's in the arena to their advantage. Another good one is like pushing pillars over on big monsters, or having big monsters push pillars over on you, and which does, like, you might be like, oh well, this is going to be, this ogre pushes a rotted pillar over on you, and it does, you're like, I'm going to use the multiple target damage even though it's one target, because I'm going to give them like a restrained condition, because they're going to get pinned if they fail. So they fail, they take a bunch of damage, and then you're like, oh well, you're restrained, you're pinned under the column. Now somebody probably has to come over, one of the bigger, beefier player characters has to come over and help you kind of pull the pillar off of you and something like that. Now you've got some more stuff that's kind of going on in combat, other than monster and PC run at each other and hit each other with sticks till one of them falls down. That's a super basic, very standard combat that we kind of want to move away from. We don't want to do that. We want to make combats more interesting. So facilitate those clever play ideas, and remember that they can go both ways. And that's pretty much everything for the master level. Like, if you hit this, if you're considering all this stuff when you're making encounters, you're going to be running great games. You're going to be running high-level games that players are really going to like. They're going to really like the combat encounters. They're going to feel like they never know what's coming next. They never know what's going to be. Right? It could be hard enemies. They're not going to know what maybe the tricks are with the enemies, what their strategies are. Fighting them on their home turf, they might have to do something like, well, we're going to try to, like, if we're fighting Swaggin or something that's like water-based or Kuatoa, and we're going to try to like pull them out. We're going to try to like kite them out of the water because they have such an advantage. Dealing with things like the cupcakes and sledgehammers, they never know the difficulty of the combat that's around the next corner that they're going to run into. And the monster motivation, what do they want out of it? What are they trying to do? Are they trying to take their gear? Are they trying to kill them? Are they trying to capture them to use them as slaves or ransom, or trying to take them alive, right? All sorts of different stuff. Death by 1,000 cuts, realizing that they're basically, a dungeon functions a lot like just a gauntlet of challenges as the party tries to get to their goal. Especially if you look at old OSR things of that nature, you'll see that there are a lot of groups that really try to avoid a lot of combat unless they have a very significant advantage over the monsters. Like, if they have very Sun Tzu style, where it's like, look, we have a better vantage point, we have twice as many people as them, like, this is a good area for us to just attack and silence these things and take whatever information and knowledge we can get out of them, whatever minor treasures we can get out of them, and hide their bodies. Things like that. As well as, right, having those alternative party or PC objectives. What are you actually trying to do in here when you're designing adventures too? Because it's very rare that an adventure, unless you're playing like a Monster Hunter adventure, like where the mission is specifically go destroy some type of creature or hunt down some type of creature, it's very rarely go kill something. So killing stuff is just roadblocks between you and your goal. And once you realize that as a player, you're like, oh, well, oftentimes I'm like, well, I just don't want to fight that thing. because it's not going to get me any closer to getting my objective, and it's going to waste a bunch of my resources. So I'm going to try, if possible, to just go around it. Just try to stealth around it, or talk to it and bribe it. There's all sorts of not direct, we jump out and try to kill a monster, ways to approach that issue. Try to get where you're trying to go. Also, if you're hitting the PCs where it hurts, especially as they get higher in level, start looking at things you can do to essentially mess with them that's not standard hit point damage. Lingering injuries, exhaustion levels, conditions of some type, cracking magic items, or doing things like that, like all sorts of weird stuff you could do with them. And this is where, if you're reaching this master level, you feel very confident. You should be feeling very confident as a dungeon master or game master about going off book, right? Off book from the rules. Like, there's no rules in the books for basically cracked or otherwise not destroyed magic items, but damaged magic items. But you could add those rules in very easily and be like, oh, well, you keep using this, and they grab it, and now there's this crack that runs along the wizard's wand, and they're like, well, let me know when you roll a 1 with one of your attacks, because that's going to make a difference. Like, something weird's going to happen. And you might inject like the wild magic table or something, like, or maybe it just explodes, or who knows. If you're like, hey, this could be really dangerous to use, and they keep using it. Now you can also go the other way and be like, let me know if you roll a natural 20 too, because now something else, maybe weird but also very cool, might happen. And especially how important doing this sort of stuff is the higher in levels you go in D&D. Specifically D&D, but for any action-based RPG. Facilitate clever play ideas. Being open to when players bring very weird things or want to do very non-standard things, being open to that, but also injecting those into the scene yourself. Like I said with the example when finding the hag's house in the swamp, the DM put that bubbling cauldron of caustic brew in there. He put it there, so I'm like, well, I might as well use it. There's a monster right next to it. And so kick it over and spill acid all over that thing. Which worked out really cool. Everybody really loved it. It was lots of fun. Basically took an alligator out by itself, because it was so much. Because it was like, the comically large witch cauldron that's got, I don't know, probably 20 gallons of liquid in it, if not more than that. So it was a lot of acid. So doing that. So if you're doing all this stuff, you're going to have really, really good encounters. They're always going to have this feeling like they don't know what's coming down the pike at them. They're always going to be kind of on their toes, and then you're going to hit them with those cupcakes, right? You're going to hit them with the cupcake, and then they're going to feel good about themselves. They'll be like, all right, well, maybe this time it's going to be different. Maybe this time, we're not going to get the tar kicked out of us. We're going to get in there. We got a good one. Our morale's high. Our confidence is maybe a little elevated, and then they get hit with the sledgehammer or a weird pick and mix, or they get hit with a very different monster motivation. Hit them with one of these other things, and then they're off balance again, trying to figure out where they need to go, what they need to do to be successful. If you're running those, you're going to be running great games. You're not going to have a hard time probably finding players. Now, this might push, depending on how you do it, you might be worried that following these sorts of things, these first 3 levels, is maybe going to pull somebody like power gamers that are going to really enjoy that, or people feel like they kind of need to do power gaming to keep up with that. Remember, the way you do the difficulty should be reactionary to the difficulty that the player characters present at the table. So if you have a number of players, maybe they're new players, or maybe they're more roleplay focused players, you can tone down this stuff. You don't have to make every fight some nail-biting death machine. You don't need to do that. You just, every once in a while, you want to give them a little spike, a little spice, something a little different on the game, on every combat. So everything's just a little bit different, and that can actually, by doing a lot of the stuff, you can actually, surprisingly, get even players who are not particularly interested in the combat aspect tied into it, because they're able to perceive different things. They're not thinking about dealing hit point damage or boosting their AC. They're doing things like, hey, these monsters look like they're doing something, or they look at those actions where the alternative party PC objectives were like, oh, actually, I don't think the object here is to kill these monsters. It's to go up here and disrupt the the magic idol that's holding the portal open or something like that. It gives them other stuff to do other than just slap monsters with their pointy sticks. So it's still going to be really rewarding even if you have one player or an entire party that's full of players who are not particularly combat driven. It just means that you don't have to go over the edge with this stuff. You should still use it. You just don't have to like pedal to the metal, full throttle, go at it like you might with a very, very big power gamer Slayer kind of group who are really, really focused on kicking down doors and killing monsters and want that to be a very big focus of the game. But even doing this, you should still do these things with people who are more sort of like actors, explorers, other sort of player archetypes who aren't as invested in the combat aspect of it. Because a lot of this stuff ties to breaking out of the very, very strict mold of how D&D and other action RPGs focus on combat. Kind of break it out a little bit to make it provide context a lot of times. A lot of other kind of bits and dials to mess with that people can pick up on. And just like we said with the non-death resolutions, like being able to inject that into your game means that if you have one of those high charisma actor sort of player characters, they can try to just parlay. They can just try to negotiate either to stop a combat or to keep it from starting completely, which can be really fun. Now, just like with anything when you're adjudicating something like that, if you have a group of players that are going through, let's say like a Cragmaw hideout situation from Mines of Phandelver, and you're basically in their home, if somebody kicks in your door and walks into your kitchen and goes, "Hey, I don't want to fight you," and you're like, well, why'd you kick in my door and rush into my home and kill my friends? Like, there are also things you cannot talk your way out of based off the situation. Especially if you're not going to use any sort of like magical charm kind of thing. Or suggestion or something like that. We're going to knock out this Paragon level next. Give your monsters magic items to use. So we're going to put, not healing potion. There's nothing wrong with using healing potions. One of the reasons that I choose not to do that is because the game already, and it really doesn't matter mostly on what game you're playing, they tend to have quite a bit of hit point bloat, which is that as you get higher and higher, monsters have more and more and more and more hit points. Like I said last time in our last video, we really want to kind of focus in 3 rounds of combat kind of seems to be the sweet spot. As I said last time, 3 rounds of combat basically allows every PC the opportunity to do something cool if they were going to do something cool, and you're going to be able to determine which of the side has the momentum in the fight. And once it's clear which side has the momentum and who's probably going to win this fight, we really want to run as quickly as possible to ending the fight. Once it's clear who's going to win, let's end the fight. It really stops that sort of what we call mop-up duty, where there's maybe 1, 2, 3 rounds of just whittling down hit points of monsters, even though at that point, right, all the characters have moved over to their most basic attacks and cantrips because they don't want to use any more resources because they know they've won the fight. So that's one of the things that actually goes right back into talking about hitting the PCs where it hurts, because that's a prime example of players being very comfortable in the amount of hit points that their characters have and their ability to heal. And so they'd rather take a little bit of damage and not use their bigger abilities, even when once it's clear that they're going to win the fight. So I don't really often want to give healing potions or other sort of healing aspects. I mean, there are some monsters that are built around that, regeneration, things like that, like trolls. Generally want to give them healing potions. I want to give them other stuff. I want to give them, especially those spell scrolls, those wands, consumable magic items, and then reward the players. If the players are able to take them out quick enough, then they get to have those consumable items. If they don't, then the monsters get a chance to use them and allows them to sort of shake up combat other than things they would normally do. Like if you have a hobgoblin commander that pulls out a wand of magic missiles and blasts the wizard in the back row with it, right, that's a total game changer when that happens, especially if that doesn't do it right out the gate. So maybe that's like the second or third round of combat, sort of at that pivotal point where you're trying to figure out, okay, we're going to be able to tell really quickly who's going to win this fight. And then you have one of the bad guys pull out a wand and blast the wizard in the back row, and there's no save, the wizard just takes damage from it. And then they could be like, whoa, okay, this encounter just got way different than I thought it was going to be. We get that mix-up that we're trying to do. We're trying to put those players on the back foot, trying to inject something new or different or novel, something they need to adapt to. So it can be really useful, as well as having really powerful, weapons. Remember that whatever magic items you give your monsters, there's a high likelihood it's going to end up in the hands of your players. So just keep that in mind. So if you want to give your big bad Death Knight like a +3 flame tongue, well, that means that somebody in the adventuring party is going to have a +3 flame tongue probably. And maybe that's not what you want to give your like level 5 fighter or paladin. Maybe you don't really want them to end up with that. Then you should probably not give it to the monster. Just like I said with sort of the Rime Ice door at that Dwarven Fortress that I didn't expect the players were going to go through. If you stat it, if you put some sort of number attached to it, it becomes within the realm of possibility in the game. So if you give your bad guys a specific item, there's a chance that the players are going to find a way to get their hands on it. And that could be as simple as having that flame tongue and then casting heat metal on it. The bad guy drops it, the cleric or whoever it is cancels heat metal or the druid and picks it up, picks the weapon up. Well, that really unbalances the fight pretty quickly in round 2 if you can do that. So keep it in mind. So I like to use consumable items. And it's fun if you get really specific ones, especially if you use the ones that don't often get used. So I'm going to say specifically other consumables. Other consumable items. So one of the most common examples of like worthless spell scrolls or potions you often get is like jump. How often does jump come up? But you could build, if you wanted to do this, right? If you're practicing this, and you have these sort of like pillars that are built up that are maybe like 15 feet in the air or something like that, and you have bad guys that each have like maybe 1 or 2 scrolls a jump on them, and they can be fighting on the ground in between the pillars, and then pull out the scroll or potion, dunk it, jump up, and now they're on top of the pillar and nobody can reach them. So you can do lots of fun stuff like that if you build in that symbiosis and be like, okay, how would they interact with this? What sort of tools, what sort of magic items might they have to help them out in this specific type of combat arena? Which may seem a little gamey, but I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that the monsters find the best way to utilize whatever arena they're in. So you could have that same very pillar structure, and that would be a great arena for something like spiders or other things that can climb on walls and things like that, where they can get on top of those pillars very easily. They can get out of melee combat with something and get on top of that and then like do a web spit or something like that. Very, very fun ways to kind of mix things up if you wanted to not use magic items in a combat arena like that. There are other specific monster types you could deal with to help with that. But this is a fun way to mix up things in combat, and then, right, provides a very in-universe reason for treasure. Of course, these things are, anything that falls under here is basically under humanoid enemies. So it's really easy to do this at lower levels. But as you get into some of the higher levels, you might run across monstrosity-based monsters and things like that necessarily don't have the intelligence or the opposable thumbs to use consumable magic items. But it is the sort of thing where you could put something cool like a collar around them, or they have some sort of badge or something. Like, there's no reason they couldn't necessarily maybe wear something like a cloak or a cape or a necklace, an amulet of some type. You could still do those sort of things. Maybe they could have a ring on one of their talons or something like that. You can still do those things. So just because you're not using a humanoid monster doesn't mean that they can't have some of those things, especially if they're tied to a humanoid enemy in some way. If they're like a dungeon pet or something like that. That's sort of the Paragon level, so it's something to keep in mind. It can really toys with their expectations, with the player's expectations. If they're fighting like, let's say, I was gonna say Wyvern. Wyvern would be kind of dumb, but this could be a fun encounter depending on how you did it. You could even say it was an Awakened Wyvern, which is actually that could actually just be a fun villain for a dungeon or an adventure in general. And so you have this Wyvern who's flying around, but they also have a necklace of fireballs. That they can cast fireballs on people. That would be a lot of fun. But so they're smart enough to be able to cast it. Even though I don't think you actually need to make an intelligence check for necklace of fireballs to cast it. I mean, but still, it would be hard to grok with sort of animal intelligence, level intelligence, if they understand how to use a magic item like that. So they might still need to be awakened. I don't know, it depends on how literal you want to get with your game. I mean, they're never going to actually know the intelligence level of the wyvern unless they stop to try to talk to it, I guess. I don't know, maybe you can just hand wave that a little bit as a DM. There's a lot of, you get into these, once we get into these higher levels of creating combat encounters and doing higher level dungeon mastery, there's a lot of sort of, in 5e in general, but especially as you get into higher level sort of things, aspects that the game doesn't really cover and you have to adjudicate a lot. Where you can be like, does this feel balanced? Does this seem like it will be fun for people involved? And I'm like, yeah, a wyvern casting fireballs sounds like a very fun kind of weird encounter, so I kind of like that. If it can do a flyby attack and then whips around and blows a fireball on the party who's just standing in a group, that could be a lot of fun. So yeah, you think about throwing magic items on them and not, like I said, try not to use healing items, just because that has a tendency to draw out combat, and generally we're trying to smush combat so it's smaller, it's tighter, not drag it out longer. Alright, next one. This ties specifically into monster motivation, variable difficulty, sort of. Reinforcements. Like I said, using the morale system is very important, which kind of goes into that very first level, that apprentice level. Stringing together encounters. Having monsters that run away, that have morale, that run away. Now that changes, often that changes the PC objectives when you see monsters run. Especially if you're like in a dungeon environment or something like that. Because you realize that if they run, they're fleeing back to get reinforcements and to alert people to your presence. Which are bad things if your PC's in a dungeon. Because that means you're going to have to fight a lot more. Which means that you're going to be doing... They have to spend more resources. That's hit dice, that's death by 1,000 cuts. All that ties into reinforcements. And stringing together encounters. The nice thing about having this variable difficulty, about not making every combat a toe-to-toe drag-out big fight, is that you have a lot more leeway about stringing together encounters. So, there are hyenas guarding the entrance to a gnoll camp or something like that. Players sneak up, they get a surprise round, they attack the hyenas, they kill most of them probably the first or second round, let's say they're a little bit higher level. Well, one of the hyenas turns tail and starts yipping and running back into the encampment. Okay, now the objective becomes stop that hyena, because if we don't, we're going to have a bunch of gnolls coming down on us. And so then they're chasing after the hyena. The hyena's running. If they don't take it down in probably a round or two, or I might do a chase sequence depending on how far they are from the camp, as I try to chase the hyena down, which can be fun. So you could have that combat transition to a chase, transition back into a combat. So they're chasing it down, and then they're immediately back into a combat because they didn't catch it in time, and now it's raised a bunch of whatever that sort of like next big encounter is in the encampment, which are gnolls and probably more hyena. That kind of strings together two combats into one combat, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But if you have very structured, this is a medium to hard difficulty fight, and a medium to hard difficulty fight that can actually be really, really difficult. That can turn basically two medium fights into a deadly fight very easily. So you have to be careful with that. That's why it's such a high level. It's under the Paragon level. That's why it's so far down on here, is that you really don't want to focus on doing that too much. Instead, you'd want to focus more on the alertness and then increased rate of random encounters, things like that. They're more prepared, there's more ambushes, things like that on those lower levels of dungeon mastering or game mastering, encounter building. Now as you're in the higher levels, you feel a lot more comfortable about sort of pulling together multiple encounters like that. Where it can be like, hey, you tried to do this, you failed at this, and it can waterfall cascade into bigger and more combat encounters. This is very close to what the Matt Colville Screw is kind of based on. What they call that, the Colville Screw. Which is basically the players playing around encounters, and then because they don't go through the encounters, those encounters are now behind them, and then they kind of collapse on top of them. Very similar kind of idea. But like I said, it's a very high level juggling act as a dungeon master, because you also don't want to set up a situation where the entire camp kind of collapses on them. because that's just going to be a wipe. If you put the player characters into a corner, or they kind of put themselves into a corner, and you throw the entire brunt of the dungeon or adventure at them, they're gonna die. Right? There's no way out of that unless they have some sort of weird like teleport or port scroll that's gonna take them back to safety. Which, if you do a lot of that, that might be a useful, powerful magic item that maybe they could buy. They can always carry around this one like get out of jail, pull yourself out of the shit token. And you can make it really, really expensive, and then they have to pull together a lot of their riches to buy another one. Which is a good way to deal with, sort of, especially in 5e, the large amount of gold that player characters end up accruing if you play by the rules, and its reward system that they don't really have a lot to spend that money on, which is a very common D&D problem, but especially in 5th edition, where magic items are not usually things that you can buy. So they just have all this money. If you give them like this port token that they could spend, 1,000 gold or something on, you can kind of pull it out of them. They can only have one at a time. They can't buy anymore. Can't carry around multiple ones, so they always have to come back and buy another one whenever they use it, or risk a dungeon collapses on them. If you want to play it that way. That's not the way I play it, but I could definitely see a very fun and engaging campaign where you do that. This really, really helps. What this really, really helps to do is showcase that encounters, each individual sort of combat encounter doesn't live in a vacuum. They don't exist in vacuums. In that, yes, we're going to set like arenas for them to be in, and they're going to play within these arenas. But if they exit the arena, there's no reason these two arenas can't be slapped together. This is not a one and done thing. Like, it's not JRPG. We're pulling you off the world map into the combat encounter. Once you finish this combat encounter, you go back to the world map. Like, these are all things that are happening. They all exist in the same space. If you're not careful, if you're not playing clever, if you're not playing smart, it's very easy that you can have these mashed together, and you end up with sort of, it's not even a gauntlet. Right, sometimes you'll see that in something like a JRPG, where you have to go through a gauntlet of fights, or like a phased fight or something like this. It's not like that. It's like having a fight, and then having an entirely new fight get immediately pushed into it all at the same time. It's not finish this fight, then immediately another fight. It's both those fights at the same time right now. Which is not good for player character health. Let's put it that way. It really increases the mortality risk. But if you're wanting to do that, that's a very easy way to do it. I try not to do this a lot, but there are circumstances in which you might want to do this, or might need to pull this sort of trick out of your hat with this reinforcements. If you have a combat that you really want to be more potent, you can have reinforcements show up, or have roll for things like random monster encounters who are going to come across these things, or can hear the combat from down the hall or something like that, because combats are not quiet. They're very loud. So it can attract attention, especially if you're what we consider in enemy territory. If you're in enemy territory, where that's a dungeon, this wood, you're sneaking around that knoll camp, you're going to alert enemies, and enemies are going to come to investigate. And if they hear the sounds specifically of combat, they're going to come running. Combat ready. So it's a good thing to sort of keep in mind. You want to telegraph that as much as possible. So if you have that, you can do the treats and timers sort of thing from Runehammer or ICRPG, where you can just like take a die and set it out on the table with a number up and let everybody see it. You don't necessarily need to explain what it is. Just be like, hey, by the way, when this clicks all the way down, something bad's going to happen. That's really all you need to know to reinforce the danger with them. They don't need to know that, hey, when this D6 that I set on 2, like in 2 rounds, more bad guys are going to show up. I don't need to tell them that more bad guys are going to show up. I just need them to let them know the gravity of the situation. Be like, hey, by the way, in this many rounds, something bad's going to happen. And that's all they need to know. So they know, all right, we need to end this combat very quickly. If that changes things, they're going to start using spell slots. They're going to maybe try to run away. They might even run away at that situation. They're like, hey, this fight, we don't think we're going to wrap it up in 2 rounds, so we're just going to run. It's a perfectly viable strategy. And I'm absolutely, if you try to run, as a DM, if you try to run from my encounter, I'm going to let you run. Now, the bad guys are going to maybe chase you. I might turn that from a fight into a flee scene, where you're actively trying to run away, and the bad guys are chasing you. I might not just be like, oh, you run away, and then you just run away. But there's going to be some sort of challenge, some sort of minute penalty, whether that's a little bit of damage or whatever, to trying to run away. For going into combat and then trying to get out of it. And I think flee scenes, like chases and flees, which a flee scene is just an inversion of a chase scene. It's just a chase scene going in the other direction. So instead of you chasing the bad guys are chasing you. And so you don't want to make it too hard, but you do want to... It does sort of like stretch out that tension, which is really nice in the game, so you don't stop a combat and immediately lose the tension of the situation. Like, no, these things are actively chasing you and you're trying to get away from them. So you can still add a little tension, maybe there's a little bit more combat that happens. It can be really fun. Make it a little bit more dynamic. And to make that very organic transition between combat to sort of an exploration kind of scene to maybe sort of a social scene. So it might be, you have the combat, the player characters, the party decides to run, they're running, they're getting chased, let's say they succeed of getting away from the bad guys, and now they have this sort of social scene where they're, catching their breath, like hiding somewhere in the woods, catching their breath, trying to figure out what to do next. As the DM, I'm narrating, like, you can still hear the sounds in the distance of the gnoll yips and the barks of the hyena as they're sort of running around, clearly still looking for you. And you can adjudicate things like that and narrate it, so it's that tension doesn't immediately deflate, but it does start to scale back down. But then also puts them in a position, hey, by the way, the longer you guys just hang out here, the more likely it is they're going to find you. So what are you guys going to do? Like, keep some of that blood pumping, keep their feet moving in the adventure, trying to progress the adventure. Be like, still, even though you're far away from them, this is maybe not the safest place to try to take something like a short rest. And that kind of goes into this. Stop worrying about encounter balance. So, and start worrying about telegraphing. So we did a lot of this kind of talking about encounter balance in the very beginning, right? This understanding sort of encounter balance and monster strategies, non-death resolutions, giving us all the tools to kind of build us up, our cupcakes and sledgehammers, our variable difficulties, moving us up to basically this. And I feel like a lot of D&D or other sort of tabletop RPG content creators kind of go from this step to this step. You'll be like, hey, it's really important to sort of like understand the system and kind of balance the encounters, to actually, you know what, it doesn't matter, do whatever you want. The encounter balance doesn't work anyway, so stop worrying about it. Which is fair, right? That's not true, but I feel like it leaves all these steps in between out. There's a lot of steps between here and here, as we're looking at, right? There's a bunch of stuff that happens in the middle. And this is all basically, all this stuff that's in the middle here, this is basically Dungeon Master experience. This is you running stuff, understanding stuff, learning things, which I'm trying to sort of set out as key things to try to actively build on, so you don't, as a Dungeon Master or Game Master, you're not sitting here just trying to figure it out for weeks or months or years on end, trying to figure out how to become better at it, how to get to the point that these content creators feel like you should be at, because they feel like you should be here at the very top and then all the way down here at the bottom, and don't really talk a lot about the in-between parts. So that's why we're talking more about the in-between parts. So like, this is sort of a stepped progression to kind of help you get there, and what the things to sort of like specifically practice on adding to combat encounters to get you to that point. So stop worrying about encounter balance. Yeah, this is the thing that comes with experience. This is the thing that when you run enough and you get familiar enough with the rule system and the monsters and your party specifically, you can kind of hand wave a lot of encounter balance. You can look at things and be like, yeah, this feels about right, or I think this should be easy, but it could be hard. The important thing for me when I think about this is, and then I do this primarily in adventure design rather than specifically encounter design, because I'm thinking about it as sort of like holistically looking at it, stepping away so I can get sort of the context and the perspective of everything. And that's basically to be like, if I assume it's an easy encounter, what happens if it's a terribly hard encounter? Or what if I want this to be a very hard encounter and they end up cakewalking through it? Because that happens more often than we would probably like to admit, when we throw what we think is going to be a really difficult encounter at our players and they just waltz through it with good rolls or clever play or they have that one specific spell that just kind of neutralizes the encounter. I've certainly done that plenty of times as a player, and you know, different dungeon masters deal with that differently. Some really like it, some think it's cool, some really hate it. And like I said, I come from it from that resource management aspect. If I have one spell that I think can completely obliterate a fight, I'm probably going to use it if we get into that fight. There's no reason I wouldn't. Save all my party members' hit points, save all my friends' spell slots and character abilities. Why would I not use one spell to completely neutralize a combat encounter? That would be silly not to. So at this point, you stop worrying as much about the encounter balance. You feel pretty good about eyeballing things. And you have the tools, right? You have this knowledge under you where you look at things and you can create a combat encounter pretty quickly, and you can add some of these other things to that combat encounter to sort of help flesh it out. And you feel, oh, I can make a pretty good combat encounter almost on the fly. I mean, maybe you can do it on the fly. It's still better to usually prep them. Instead, you start worrying about telegraphing, which means, like I said with the overpowered construct example from the game that I ran, is it's okay to now start throwing completely inappropriate combat encounters, monsters into combat on both sides. Right? You can throw incredibly powerful monsters in there and be like, hey, we're going to use telegraphing because we're focusing on an alternative party or PC objective. This is very, if you watch Seth Skorkowski's, I believe it's his heist video, where he talks about planning a heist, where he talks about the dragon having a monster having some sort of combat encounter that's so overpowered that's an unwinnable situation, basically. And so being able to appropriately telegraph that, just like having the portal where more hordes of small minions spew out of. There's nothing in this encounter that you can do. There's no amount of killing you can do in this encounter that is going to beat this encounter. There's nothing you can do with that. So there's something else going on. This in the heist one, in Seth Skorkowski's heist video, the dragon is sort of like the looming threat of when the heist goes bad, like goes really, really bad, and it shows up. And this is like the SWAT team. This is something like, you can't fight this. So you were actively avoiding it. Very much having a Bilbo Baggins moment where that engagement with Smaug is about getting in there and checking out the situation. And trying to steal something. Bilbo is not going to kill Smaug, right? That is not going to happen. But we telegraph that. It's very clear that that's not going to be a fight. That Smaug as a monster is so overpoweringly powerful, so outside the range of being able to be killed, that getting into a fight with this thing is a fail state. That is a fail state of the game. So we need to telegraph that. That's the important thing. His armor is, impervious to human weapons. And the important thing is finding like the one chink in the armor. And now it's a gimmick monster. Which, if you don't know what a gimmick monster is, it's basically a monster that you need to know something about the monster to beat it. Right? That it has some sort of specific vulnerability that you need to know and exploit to actually beat it. For trolls, that's fire and acid. Right? They regenerate. Even if you reduce it to 0 hit points, it's going to get back up and fighting unless you kill it with fire, basically. Or acid. So that's one. The Medusa, like a classic Medusa Gorgons one. Right? It's going to turn you to stone, so you've got to figure out some way to get around this blinding light. For werewolves, it's silver. Right? You need to have some sort of silver weapon to be able to damage them because they're immune to bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing from non-magical weapons, unless they're silver. Vampires with stakes through the heart and sunlight. What we think of as often classic monsters are gimmick monsters. So you can use that as part of your telegraphing, which would be a very cool way to have an encounter with a very, very powerful creature that they can sort of asymmetrically fight. It's very fun. Or you can use it to basically chase them around the dungeon. So telegraphing is a very fancy way, and it's really more of an OSR term. But it's about being able to showcase the threat level of an encounter or a monster before you come into it. So it's giving you the little clues, the little tidbits of what's to come. It's very sort of cinematic in that language too. Is that if you come across rooms that have scorch marks all over them, if they have half-eaten bodies, or monsters that have been ripped in, like forcibly ripped in half by through sheer brute force, things like that. That kind of showcase, oh, there is something like big and really bad in this dungeon. And these need to be, the examples you need to show are not like, hey, it's a kobold that's ripped in half. It's like, oh, this is like a bugbear that got ripped in half. Like, that's a big monster to rip in half. Like, that takes a lot of strength, and a bugbear is not a super slouch of an enemy. So the bugbear is pretty strong. So if it's grappled a bugbear and was able to rip that bugbear in half, then we know that this is a very strong creature that's in here, and we know that it's probably like some sort of big giant of some type or something like that. Especially if it didn't eat the bugbear, if it just ripped it in half. So you do that to sort of like give them clues about what's coming up and whether or not they want to fight that thing. Or with the, all the scorch marks, maybe it's some sort of big fire elemental, maybe it's a dragon. So start giving them these clues and showcasing that it's really bad. And if they meet people and talk to them in the dungeon, they can tell them about, telling them about that monster, whether because the players ask about it, or just goes out, the NPC can just go out of their way to tell them about it, or to be worried about it, or something. You can inject it pretty naturally, be like, hey, are you servants of the dragon, or whatever, who are here? Because maybe they're not servants of the dragon, something like that. It's very easy to sort of do that. So start telegraphing that stuff, like showcasing that stuff. It's very much, if you ever play the original BioShock game, and the first time that you get introduced to a Big Daddy is watching that Big Daddy fight somebody else, like that's telegraphing. That's showcasing the threat of the Big Daddy as far as the Big Daddies in BioShock. Kind of showcasing that whole situation with the little sisters. So doing those sorts of things. Now, be aware that if you ever put your player characters in a situation where they can see an action scene happening, like 9 times out of 10 they're going to get involved in that action scene because they don't understand that that's more of a vignette. They believe they're the main characters and they should take action. That's why in something like BioShock, right, they don't let you take part in that scene, right? That's just something you watch. It's a cutscene, basically. But there are no cutscenes in something like a tabletop RPG, so if you showcase them, they're 9 times out of 10 they're going to find some way to get involved if they can, by some sort of ridiculous hijinks. So and you have to be very careful with framing devices like that. If you put it in front of the players are probably going to try to fight it at some point. That's why we're doing all this telegraphing, to be like, hey, you don't want to do that. I'm trying to showcase to you how dangerous, how above your threat level this creature is, or these monsters are, so you don't do that. So our last one here in Paragon, and this is, I thought about putting it earlier, but I decided to put it here. It's random encounters. Random encounters get a lot of bad, let's say, publicity, especially from modern sort of dungeon masters. And that is, I feel like, 100% the game's fault. Even the DMG does a very bad job of telling you why to use random encounters. They do an okay job of telling you when to use them, but they don't tell you why to use them. So random encounters, in the way that I view them, or the way that it really clicked for me, because I used to be in that camp. I used to be in, like, I don't really like random encounters. Like, why would I be rolling for this? Why would I have some sort of combats that don't advance the plot? It's because what they really are is they're timers for an adventure. Because they're active timers, because what they do is they do this. That's what they focus on. They're hitting the PCs where it hurts. It's death by 1,000 cuts. It's hitting the PCs where it's hurt. The whole point is that it is an encounter that doesn't further the plot. Like, it doesn't further the adventure for them fighting it. It's instead just eking resources out of them. And you need to make that clear as a Dungeon Master. Of course, Dungeon Master's Guide and most systems don't make that clear to Dungeon Masters, to Game Masters, is that that's what it's for. It's an active timer. We have a lot of passive timers in adventures where they're like, oh, you need to stop the dark ritual before this time, etc., before midnight, or when the moon's high, the new moon, or... But this is an active timer, which means that you can add it to any adventure that doesn't have an active timer. So if you have a dungeon delve that's like, we're just trying to get a magic relic, it doesn't really matter when we get the magic relic. I mean, it might in sort of like the meta-narrative of the campaign. But as far as it's like, we have to have it by midnight, there's no sort of timer like that. Random encounters are active timers, so they push. If we talk about sort of the carrot, the random encounters are the stick aspect of that. They're the ones that kind of slap the players on the butt, and they're like, hey, you need to keep moving. Because when they're used incorrectly, it's like, we're going to take an extended rest, we're going to take a long rest. Up, goblins popped up and attacked us. We defeated the goblins and went back to sleep. Like, that's not what the random encounter is supposed to be. Random encounter is supposed to be like, hey, you got attacked by goblins, and the 4 hours you just spent on rest before that did nothing. You get the effects of a short rest, sure, but now you have to start the extended rest over again, and you're going to have to do more random encounters during that, because you're trying to sleep in an actively occupied dungeon, occupied with hostile forces who don't want you here and will try to maim and kill you on sight because you're in their home. You keep doing that, they're going to keep doing the thing. But often you need to make that kind of clear to the party that that's why these things are happening. And so random encounters are to keep the players moving. That's when they're used best. So it's nice to have a table of random encounters for any sort of biome or dungeon that you're in that you can roll on. When they're taking a rest is a great way, especially if they're trying to take a long rest in the middle of a dungeon. It's a bad idea. You get punished for bad ideas until you learn that that's not a good idea. The other ways that it works is that if players get to a point, get stuck. I know Matt Colville has talked about this on his channel before, and I don't think he was relating it specifically to random encounters, but they're very tied together. So let's say you want to put a puzzle in your dungeon. And the players are struggling with the puzzle because puzzles tend to kind of go one of two ways. It's a puzzle that one of the players kind of already knows. Whether that's a specific riddle, or they're just really good at something like Sudokus or spatial puzzles or whatever, and they just very quickly do it. And you're like, oh, well, that seemed like kind of a wasted encounter. They didn't really spend a lot of time on it. Or it kind of goes the other way, where they end up getting stuck and they don't know how to proceed and they don't know how to do the solution. This can happen really often with like codes or cryptograms or ciphers, things like that nature, that are not super intuitive, not super easy to figure out. You can run into that a lot of times, which is one of the reasons why I don't often put puzzles in my games, because they're just a flat stop. It's a big old stop sign in the game. Players walk up to it and either they know the answer and then it was kind of pointless to have this anyways because they just kind of walk through it, or they completely slap up against it and they get stuck and they don't know how to do the situation. They don't know how to get through it, and then at some point you might get frustrated as a dungeon master and be like, okay, make me some checks. All right, here's the solution. Nobody likes that. You don't like it as a DM, and the players don't like being like, well, we couldn't figure out the challenge, so our dungeon master just kind of gave us the answer. Well, that feels great. I'm really glad I'm playing this level 20 intelligence wizard, and I'm just a regular old dum-dum human who can't figure out a simple puzzle, even though my player character would probably be able to do that. Right, that kind of takes you out of the immersion. So those are kind of the ways it goes. So I don't typically run puzzles, and if I do run puzzles or have some sort of code or password or keys or whatever it is that aren't just like a standard tumbler lock, like it has some sort of like magic lock or some sort of weird mechanism that a thief's not really going to be able to pick because they don't know what they're looking at, then you need to have alternative ways to get through that. But if they get there and they're trying to figure it out, there'll be a point, if you're sitting back and watching this as a Dungeon Master, where the conversation will become circuitous. They're gonna start arguing about the same thing over and over again. And once that happens, once they're no longer feels like they're making forward progress on the puzzle, they start talking around in circles, that's when you start rolling for random encounters. So first off, we know as Dungeon Masters, if you've been Dungeon Mastering for any amount of time, the moment you start rolling dice, every player at the table is like, what are you doing? Why are you rolling? Right? It immediately draws focus at the table. And you can decide whether to tell them what you're rolling for or not. I feel like with a lot of people I run with at this point, that if they know I'm rolling for something, that's usually not good for them. So sometimes that's enough, and they'll be like, let's go somewhere else then. Or I'll get to the point, oftentimes the threat of an encounter is actually more useful than a combat encounter itself. So if you just threaten them like, oh, you hear some footsteps and the soft murmur of talking down one of the tunnels of the dungeon, and they appears to be growing louder, they'll be like, okay, we need to move on. We're obviously not going to get through this puzzle door. So they might move on. And sometimes that's enough. They're going to try to find some other way, assuming that this is not a puzzle that is a choke point, you have to get through this door or the rest of the adventure just doesn't happen. If there's alternative routes, which you should always build into adventures, then that's not going to be a problem. Or they have some other way to get the answer to that. So oftentimes if I am doing a puzzle or there's some sort of cryptogram or cipher or something like that, at some point there's a monster or an adventurer or an NPC or somebody who has the answer basically in their pocket, like written down on a scrap of paper, or maybe it's between a few different ones have basically a collected answer. So get all the answers by going through the rest of the dungeon, and then you'll be like, oh, I have the answer. And then it still feels like the players have earned that, even though they get to go back and be like, oh, it's blah, blah, blah. Then they do that, and then the door opens, and they're like, oh, that's great, we got the solution. And it wasn't our DM having to be like, all right, roll me intelligence check. Okay, you figure out the first word is this. Something like that, which doesn't feel good. Instead, you get a way for them to feel good about it, because like, oh, I remembered to check the pockets of this enemy, and I found the note that's the answer to the door. Because this dum-dum couldn't remember the way to get through the door, so they wrote it down. Or they have the key, or whatever methodology it is to open things up. Random encounters work as those sort of active timers. So anytime that your players get stuck in a dungeon on a choice where they have that sort of circular conversation where they're not really making a decision about anything, this is really prevalent in published adventures, but also shows up in homebrew adventures, where they have a room that has too many doors to it, or an intersection in a dungeon corridor that splits off into different directions, and they don't know which way to choose. And so they're just kind of talking around it. Put the pressure on them. That's what random encounters are. They're pressure to be like, hey, you hear guys coming this way. You hear something coming this way. And pretty much at that point, they'll just pick a direction and go for it. And that's better than them sitting there spending 15 minutes at the game table going back and forth about making a random decision about what door to go through or something like that. Just give them that little active push, and that usually pushes them forward. You can also do this if you have the sort of party that trap scared. If you hit them with the trap in the very beginning of a dungeon, and now they're like obsessively checking every flagstone as they're going through the dungeon, checking every wall, every ceiling, and it's very just slow progression because they're so worried about traps. And there's not traps coming up. Does that, especially early on in dungeon, does that to players. They're like, oh, this place must be filled with traps then, because we got hit by a trap really early in the dungeon, so every corridor is probably trapped. So if you want to push them to go faster, that's when you have the footsteps coming that way. And if they still decide to do that, then you have an encounter. An encounter that really doesn't net them any treasure, doesn't really net them any experience, doesn't really net them any more information or advances the adventure plot in any way. It just sucks resources from them. And at some point they'll be like, we don't want to have extra encounters, we're going to just keep moving. Which is what you want. You're trying to get them to keep moving. Now, don't do that and be like, they're worried about traps, and then I harry them and then run them directly into another trap. They're not going to be happy with you as a dungeon master or game master if you do that. If you use the threat of a combat to push them into another trap that they otherwise would have found by searching. You can also just speed it up and be like, I assume that you are actively looking for traps now. And when you're going down the corridor, whoever's in the front is actively looking for traps. So give me your marching order. That's a very easy way to do that. Often if I do that, I run traps a little bit differently anyways. I often tend to run the traps have active stealth that gets a passive perception score, rather than have them active, instead of having the player characters determine that they are always actively looking for a DC that is the stealth level of a trap. Something like that. So I just kind of invert it to make it a little bit more interesting. Just kind of ask for them what their passive perception is, or what their passive investigation. I guess passive perception is, and assuming that they are looking for traps, so if they have any specific bonuses for finding traps, like if they have stone cunning or something like that, that might add to it and give them the bonuses from that. And then just have the traps roll active stealth against that passive score when they come across it. That's generally how I use it, is that it works as an active timer rather than having a timed because not every adventure is going to have a timed condition. You need to do it before X happens. So it's helpful to have a different way to sort of push, a different sort of method, a different dial you can tune in to sort of push player characters along the adventure progression. They're random encounters. That's how random encounters are supposed to be used. They're not just supposed to be, well, random. They are random as to what the encounter is, but they have a very specific purpose in the game. And oftentimes that isn't communicated very well to DMs or GMs, and they either figure that out or they don't ever figure it out. Because I've played with a lot of DMs and GMs who have never really figured that out about random encounters, so they don't ever use them. And they're like, no, it's a tool. It's just a tool for a very specific purpose. It's not to fill time. Like, when random encounters are not really used well is, like, random attacks on the road. I have planned encounters on roads, on, like, overland travel. But if we're doing, like, hexploration, if we're, like, hex crawling and just, like, investigating stuff, then yeah, you're going to come across random stuff. Right? I'm not going to plan out specific encounters for specific hexes because I have no idea in a hex crawl what direction the party's going to go. So instead I'll have, like, random encounters. And again, those random encounters are often not explicitly combats. There's often a lot of times where the sight lines are so far away when the encounter starts. The encounter starting distance is so far away that players can choose to avoid them. They can try to go up and talk to humanoid creatures if they want, even monsters, and that's feasible sometimes. So there's a lot of ways to use them, but the important thing is why you use them. And that's really only something you get at sort of like that Paragon level, which you're like a quite experienced dungeon master or game master, when it clicks for you, like, this is how you use random encounters and why you use them in the games. It's a pressure dial. It's to keep the pressure on the PCs and to stop them from, like, the 15-minute workday kind of things. They're like, oh well, we're gonna take an extended rest a long rest in this dungeon. It's like, well, that's really dumb because this dungeon's full of bad guys. And they're going to know somebody's in here. They're going to be actively looking for you. They're going to find you. There's no reason they won't, especially if you're resting for like 8 hours. They're going to find you. They have plenty of time. The only time that might happen is if you were running something like a mega dungeon that is a sprawling labyrinth that's so huge that it's unlikely that somebody might come by all the time, walk through this specific passageway all the time. But otherwise, most small dungeons, yeah, there are people moving through at all hours of the day and night. Like, you're gonna get found. They're gonna find you, and they're gonna attack you, and they're not gonna stop attacking you for 8 hours to make sure that you get quality shut-eye. They're not really concerned with that. That's not their motivation. That's not their monster motivation. That's everything in the Paragon. So now we're gonna drop in. We're gonna do this last one. We're gonna talk about our god tiers, our very important stuff. Of course, if you guys have any questions up to this point, make sure to drop them down. I will address them as possible. So now we're down at the very bottom. We're down to, if you've been doing all this stuff, you're running, especially, you see a lot of this Paragon stuff. We see that now we're talking about things that are outside, sometimes the very specifics of building combat encounters. We're talking about combat encounters and building combat encounters that are now more relational to the other combats that we're having planned for whatever adventure we're prepping, or whatever session we're prepping. That's when you can really tell, like, you're really experienced dungeon masters. Now you stop thinking about encounters as like their own sort of things. They're a part of a much broader whole, and there's a lot of interplay between them that you work with. And gives you the ability to do things like telegraphing and throwing monsters that are not appropriately leveled in either way. You can also do, I think I glossed over it, but you can also do an encounter balance. We talked about sort of the dragon, the unkillable enemy that's so powerful, but you can also do the opposite of that, where you can actually start to make the players kind of feel a little bad. It's be like, you're just mopping up kobolds who are trying to live their lives, and you're like 11th level adventurers. You guys aren't exactly doing anything heroic here. You basically broken somebody's door and just decided to slaughter a bunch of weak creatures. Maybe you're not the greatest guys in the world, which is very interesting. That can give, when I'm playing a player character, I like that sort of stuff, because I'm like, there's so many aspects where my player characters are like, well, I'm just not going to kill this creature. Like, I've already beat this creature. I've already won the day. I'm just gonna let them run away. I don't care. As long as they're not going to go get help, like, be like, hey, just get out of here. I don't care. to show mercy is a very cool aspect to add to the RP of a character, you as a player character, is to add that sort of merciful aspect of it. Be like, yeah, we don't need to kill these guys. We're like, hey, if you ever show your face around here again, I will kill you. But otherwise, just get out of here. I don't need to kill you. I've killed enough things. Alright, so now we're getting into the very, very high level stuff, the very specific stuff, the stuff that's really going to set you apart as a dungeon master compared to most other dungeon masters. Highlight specific PC strengths and weaknesses. And I already talked about this a little bit, so if you were paying attention already, that's how enmeshed all these concepts are. Why it's so important to definitely go back and watch the first video. If you haven't watched it, go watch the first video, so that way you'll be able to layer on top of that knowledge. But highlight specific strengths and weaknesses. You notice that I talked about that with the Clockwork Construct encounter I talked about having. That was sort of chasing the adventurers through the dungeon, or the spell slot eating magic trap that the fighter is able to go in, or rogue is able to go in, and this is simple. That's what we're talking about. We're highlighting very specific PC strengths and weaknesses. That spell slot eating trap is a very specific weakness and a very specific strength on how to deal with that. And it makes magic-based characters, who are almost always way stronger than martial-based characters, very weak in that sort of encounter. Whatever that encounter entails. As long as that trap is in there, they're very much weak. And it shows this really cool, that's a very cool, like, thief thing to be in. Like, oh, I have a thief who's specifically trained in Arcana. Like, they're an intelligence-based rogue. Go in there, and I know they're trained in Arcana, and I built this very specific situation for them to be able to go in and showcase how cool they are. Like, to build those very individual PC moments to be like, this is the thing that you're really good at. It goes back to the last video we did talking about that bizarre, like, level 17 party where they're fighting the 50 plus shadows. It's like, you want to talk about highlighting specific PC strengths. We talked about that cleric who's going to destroy undead and basically neutralize that entire encounter in 2 rounds by themselves. Like, that's highlights a PC strength. We talked about it there. Whereas the cleric player's going to feel really great. They're like, I got to do the cool thing that I don't often get to do. Look how cool I am. I basically obliterated this entire encounter without lifting a finger with anybody. Nobody got hurt. We blew through these things. I feel awesome. Everybody's like, that was super cool. To highlight those moments. And then having, juxtaposed to that, also having positions where it's like, hey, this is the specific fuck you encounter. This is the one where you have to rely on your friend's help to get through this, because you're not going to be able to do much here. Which, again, these are not things you want to do every single fight, but you do want to do them pretty often. Like, having that big fight with a high level fiend, where you have the paladin who's able to go in there and throw their biggest, baddest smites on it and rip through it. That's always going to feel good. There's always going to be high fives in there. And the paladin player is going to feel great being able to just absolutely rip through demons and devils like that. Very cool. Absolutely. Having the cleric destroy undead. Very cool. Also sweet. Having some sort of thing, ranger encounter, where the ranger's specific beastmaster is really tied to, or their interplay is really tied to it, is very cool. And I'm trying to think of what that would be off the top of my head. It would depend on whatever sort of animal they had. So if they had a cool animal they could ride or something like that, something specific their animal did would be really cool. Like I could imagine having a wilderness sort of adventure where there's a flying bad creature that's really hard to deal with when they're flying. And having the ranger who's really skilled at archery being able to shoot it in coordination with maybe their own, like, hawk beast companion or something, attacking the thing's eyes or driving it down to the ground so it crashes into the ground so everybody else can attack it. Like, that's a very cool, like, oh, good thing we had the ranger, because they had this really cool specific ability they were able to do stuff with. And then also building in those weaknesses as well. Like, there's very lazy ways to do it, like the anti-magic zones are very easy ways to throw spellcasters kind of under the bus, but those always feel kind of a little lame. You really want to pick one player character, not like a large section of the party to kind of focus on. It's kind of want to be one. So it'd be very cool to have like an inversion where you have that paladin fighting fiends, but instead of a strength, now it's like actually a super weakness, because maybe that fiend, by whatever reason, is so is so changed, is so altered to be so specifically neutral that their smites don't work on them, and be like, oh, that's weird. Oh, now I feel less useful. And have them also be able to sort of pick apart at the things the paladin's specifically not good at, or able to sort of screw with like their save aura or stuff like that. Like the neutrality. There's this neutral aura they have that actually dampens and cancels out sort of their holy aura. The thing is like, oh well, I've got to rely on my friends because this thing's really coming after me, and kind of focus on one specific characters. You can do that with like Nothics and wizards and things like that. Those can be really cool fights. Really focus on their weakness, and maybe trying to turn a wizard into its own Nothic would be really very interesting and charming. Learning all its secrets and running away and all that sort of stuff. And maybe instead of, so Nothics by definition kind of learn your secrets, but what if instead this is like an extra powerful Nothic, and maybe it's stealing information from you, and like it's stealing your prepared spells out of you or something like that. Like that's what they're doing to the wizard, like eating that out of it, and then maybe now they're able to cast it in that encounter. Maybe, you know, you're fighting the Nothic, and the Nothic is able to do their thing, and then you just ask the wizard, hey, what 3rd level spells do you have prepared today? Okay, well, you don't have that one prepared anymore, and then he turns around, and now the Nothic casts Fireball on the rest of the party. You're like, oh no, the wizard's such a liability, you gotta get out of here, it's stealing your knowledge, and it's fueling the bad guy. This is the sort of things you start getting into when you're that higher level sort of dungeon mastery. It's like, you're gonna break the game now, you're gonna do all sorts of weird stuff with the game. And you want to highlight those very specific PC strengths and those very specific PC weaknesses to make it feel very personal challenges for them, and very personal, like high moments, and then moments where they have to really rely on their friends, where they're kind of the liability of everything. Like we said, we could do maybe instead of a paladin, maybe it's a fighter in heavy armor. Well, we're going to throw them into an encounter where the room fills with water. Well, now your fighters are a liability, because they're not going to be able to swim in plate armor, and they're going to start actively drowning, especially if there's creatures in the waters or other hazards that attack them, so they have to make those con saves or to resist like actively drowning. Those sorts of things where you can have really cool things like, now I have to really rely on the rest of the party to carry me through this one. I'm just not going to be useful, and I'm going to be a liability in this combat. Same things go with something like a calm emotion aura on a nasty bad guy, especially if you want to do like maybe some like succubi, incubi kind of fight, and you have this big angry barbarian charging down on this thing, and they have to make like a save once they hit the aura, and they get into the aura, and if they fail, they get like calm emotion on them, and like snaps you out of rage. You lose your rage. And then, like, if you stay in it longer and maybe you get charmed more by it, now you're actively confused by it, and now you're charmed by it, and now the barbarians that succubis or incubi sort of servant during the fight, protecting them. Sorts of weird things like that, where you're relying on a specific player character's strengths, and they actually become very much a weakness, a liability for the party in specific fights. Alright, let's do our next point. So this is a fun one. This is one that doesn't get brought up very much. How do I want to phrase this? It's definitely written down very weird in my notes. So how do I want to phrase this specifically? Let's just say stop combat escalation. If you've been running D&D or any TTRPG for a while, especially these action-based ones, whether that's Pathfinder, any sort of OSE or other OSR sort of stuff, you almost always come across some sort of internet advice where it talks about my players are just they're just curb stomping all my combat encounters. They're just so good, and I keep making harder and harder encounters, and they just keep galvanizing and getting better and better and better at fighting them. And how do I stop this combat escalation? Because now it's screwing up my ability to figure out, because now this stuff up here doesn't really make sense anymore, because they're so well honed at very specific combat stuff that now the gauges I'm using to try to figure out whether something is an appropriate encounter or not now no longer work. And so I'm also not trying to like TPK them, but also I don't want to make a bunch of combat encounters that they just walk over. And a lot of the advice that I see often online some of it is this stuff about like how to build like more nuanced encounters that had kind of more stuff going on, or other ways to challenge it other than just throwing monsters that have more hit points, better armor classes, and better attacks at them. But some of these other sort of like nuanced stuff with other dials that you can mess with in encounters. But oftentimes that doesn't actually stop the combat escalation. So the thing is that you are feeding that echo chamber. If you reward optimizing for combat with harder combats that they feel like they have to optimize for, and then you have to make harder combats and they optimize more for combat and you bring harder, you're just escalating the issue. That's all you're going to end up doing in the end. And this is really, really good if you have a group of players that are really combat keen. They're very strong power gamers. They're very strong slayers. They're really focused on that specific aspect of the game. Then you're always going to do that. The only way to not feed that is to stop giving them positive feedback for putting all their eggs in the combat basket. You actually want to reduce the number of combats that you're getting in, or make the combats actually easier. Because if you make the combats really easier and there's less volume and less difficulty in those encounters, what you're going to end up with is you're going to have players who feel like they have a handle on combat. So they have this idea that they are very comfortable in a situation that they feel like they're going to come out on top, which is good. That's what you want. Because one of the things, and I played with a group for a very long time that the DM did this, where there was a lot of combat escalation, where it was like, I felt like every time I was leveling up my character, every time I had to make a character choice decision, it was like, okay, what is the most optimized combat thing I can do at this level? What sort of trait can I take that can be absolutely going to make my character better for working with the party, better able to do their one specific one-trick pony thing, or whatever it is. Because I have to, because if not, I'm going to get the snot kicked out of my character, I'm going to be the liability for the party, nobody's going to be happy with me, etc, etc, etc. Even though, me as a player, I'm not super power gaming. I mean, I enjoy having I want to have a character that feels adequate in combat. If I feel like they're capable, then that's good. That's good enough for me. If I feel like I'm not pulling down the party, I feel pretty good about it. If you want your characters to not being so combat oriented, you have to start steering them away from combat. You have to give them these sorts of things, right? That we talked about. Those dragon encounters, things that they can't. You have to give them the alternative PC objectives. You have to give them things in fights where killing monsters is never going to be the answer. And if you can do that, they'll start to learn, okay, or you start throwing more exploration encounters at them. You can throw some more puzzles at them. You can throw some more environmental things they have to get across, like more traps and hazards and things like that. More social encounters, things that they can't, other situations that they cannot fight their way through to advance the adventure. If you start to do that, if you start to put that pressure on them, they're going to feel more comfortable about taking character options, non-combat character options. That's spells that they prepare, abilities that they choose, whether that's archetypes or whatever their subclasses. Skills that they put points into. If they feel like if they're not riding the razor's edge in combat all the time, then they can feel more comfortable taking the non-combat stuff, which maybe they want. That kind of gives them a more well-rounded player character. It kind of gives them those, tool proficiencies and, my character doesn't really have a lot of charisma, but I'm going to give them intimidation anyways, because I feel like that's just sort of how they address things, right? That's a good thing for the barbarians, even though barbarians rarely get to use their intimidation, because it's a charisma skill, and the charisma is usually their dump stat, or next to their dump stat after intelligence. So having those sorts of things, they kind of push more participation in those exploration and social encounters, and that's going to relax them a bit. They don't feel like they always need to be gearing up for some tough as nails fight, which is really, really helpful. So most groups I find groups are different, but it's been my experience, at least my personal experience, that most groups are pretty okay doing 1 to 2 sessions of gaming in a row where they don't have a combat. Any more than that, and they start getting really antsy. Now, if you have a very combat power gamey Slayer type of group, you can probably only get away with one session. But you can always have a session that doesn't have any combat in it. That's perfectly fine. You still have 2/3 of the game to play with. There's still lots of investigation they can do, lots of talking to people they can do, putting them in those situations where killing somebody is probably not helpful for whatever they're trying to get done. Where you toss in like a mystery or something like that, and you can still have action scenes in it. Like I said, you can really rely on those sort of chase scenes or those fleeing scenes. Let's say you're doing a murder mystery thing, and this is a suspect, and you go to talk to the suspect, and you twinge on something, or you roll a bad social check, or whatever it is, and they do a runner. They take off. They go running. And now it's a chase scene. You have to chase them down, but you also don't want to kill them because you're still trying to question them. But that gives your like more active, more combat-focused things. They can use some spells to sort of like trip them up, or knock them down, or slow them. You know, they're entangled. They can do cool fightery things because they're going to have really good athletics, things like that, where they can chase after them and do those. Knock them down, hold them, grapple them, and hold them, and drag them out. And maybe there's crowded market. Maybe the guards get involved, and now you have to have the talky people talk to the guards, and maybe you have to have the fighter who knocks this person out and like throws them over fireman style over their shoulder and has to like run off. Now the guards are chasing you, and this is a totally different fleeing scene now. So you just transition them very naturally into one another and do that. And if right, there's still a lot of action, but it's not combat. Well, yeah, I mean, chase scenes, ideally you don't want to have a chase scene where the enemies can just absolutely have a different movement vector, or like flying, where they can just fly away. That's not, because then it's not much of a chase, right? If they can't catch them. If it's some sort of like low flying thing, and maybe they can jump up on the roofs and jump onto the back of one of them, that'd be really cool way to take them down. Or there's some way that they can't, you know, fly straight up and just end the chase that way. Swimming's another good one. Like if you give them like a pond or something they can swim through, it's like you can run around the pond, but it's going to be a little bit more difficult for you. Or they're going to stay in the pond, and then you can surround the pond and then try to grapple them and get them out of there. It should be a challenge. You don't want to set up a chase scene where it's not much of a chase, like they're just going to get away. If you want the bad guy to get away, you can just have the bad guy get away. Like you said, you can just have them fly off. Right? That's very easy to do. You can have them teleport or something like that. But a chase scene is about having action. So yeah, that's been my if you want to stop combat escalation, the best way to do that is to downplay the amount of combat, the difficulty and the volume of combat in your games. And that'll really cut them out. And of course, like any situation, it helps to talk to the players. And I'll be like, hey, you guys are really like bowling over all the combats. I'd like to focus some stuff away from that, just to kind of keep things more balanced as far as the game is going. You can have that conversation with them, and you can even ask them at that point to be like, hey, would you guys mind retconning some of your player decisions, because I want to do more investigation, or I want to do more wilderness exploration, or I want to do more social scenes. So if you guys want to go in and like change some of your spell choices, or change some of the skills that you have, or some of the abilities you've taken, so that way you guys are able to do these things as well. Because we want to have kind of a well-rounded game where we use all the different pillars. And like I said, it's been my experience that most groups are happy with at least one session of no combat at all. Whether that's exploration, or talking to people, or has a bunch of downtime in it, engaging with that aspect of the game. Like you can do all that stuff. So multiple faction combat encounters. These are encounters in which they're not just good guys and bad guys. There are good guys and bad 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 guys. Where you can set up factions where it's kind of like a number of small encounters kind of put together, but everybody's fighting everybody. It's kind of a very battle royale situation. These can be really, really interesting because it depends on how the encounter sparks off. Because you can absolutely have an encounter where a very standard, like you're sneaking in through the dungeon and you're fighting the kobolds. You're making a bunch of ruckus. And uh-oh, here come the goblins that are over that way. They're coming down the hallway. And now you have a three-way fight because the goblins don't like the kobolds. And the kobolds don't like you, and you don't like the goblins. So now it's 3 factions fighting each other. You can have multiple factions, but you could also have a situation that you could have the player characters sneak up on these 2 factions already fighting in the dungeon. And that goes very much to Keep on the Borderlands, Caves of Madness kind of thing, where you have a bunch of different factions that are fighting together, and you can play them off of each other. Well, it's okay to do that in encounters too. And the nice thing is like, if you have that encounter where you have the players and they're fighting kobolds and some goblins show up, and one of those goblins runs off and some of the kobolds run off, and now you're like, okay, now there are 2 factions that are aware that the PCs are in dungeon complex or whatever it is. So now there are 2 that are alerted and kind of specifically looking for you, and more often than not, they're looking to exterminate you, right? They're probably trying to kill the player characters and take their stuff. But it could also be, hey, there's this weird third party who showed up. Let's try to negotiate with them. Like, we want to invite them in and get them on our side, and we want them fighting for us. And so maybe the kobolds hire you to fight the goblins. I mean, that is basically what happens in Sunless Citadel, the published adventure. That's basically the setup for Sunless Citadel, in a lot of ways, is you literally have kobolds that are fighting goblins, and depending on which faction you run into first, you can actually parlay and work with them and get on one of their sides. And then once you're done clearing out one side of the dungeon, you can decide whether you want to keep that allegiance or not, or if you want to turn on your benefactors and slaughter them too. Again, that might be one of those things where I'd be like, are you guys sure that you're the good guys? Because you're acting like you're not the good guys. So keep that in mind, that you do have some sort of karma as far as sort of your reputation. Like, if you go back to the tavern and you tell people your grand adventure about how you told the goblins you were going to help them, and then you killed all the kobolds, and then you went back on your word and killed them, well, now people just know that maybe your word doesn't mean very much, and you're very duplicitous. So that might change how people interact, how NPCs interact with the party members. They're like, yeah, I'm not sure if I can trust your word, because the stories I've heard of you is that your word doesn't mean much and you double-cross people. So now, the one thing you want to avoid when you're doing this is you don't want to get too far down in the weeds. You don't want to have too many factions in there, because at some point it's like when you have scenes as a dungeon master or game master, like a social scene where there's too many NPCs in it, and you end up spending a little bit too much time talking to yourself or playing with yourself behind the screen. Like, okay, well, these goblins attack this kobold. Okay, does this much damage? There's a lot of that you can just kind of hand wave behind the screen and be like, okay, each of these goblins takes 3 points of damage from this round, and each of the kobolds takes 5 points of damage. And that just sort of hand waves them fighting each other. But still feels like that's impactful because they're still actually doing damage to each other. So that's a very easy way to handle that and not have to spend a whole bunch of time where it's your monsters are rolling dice to attack other monsters. Which is not, well, it's not the most fun play experience at the table as a player, when you're watching the DM just do DM stuff behind the screen, not talking to you, and you're like, well, just kind of waiting for my turn in combat, but after my dungeon master gets done taking 20 turns between goblins and kobolds, we don't want to slow down the game for that, so let's speed that up. Just be like, yeah, they just kind of do damage to each other. And hand waving, get back to the player characters, because they are the main characters of the adventure, right? That's the whole point of the campaign. So they're the main characters, so let's focus in on them. And here's the last point that we're going to put down here. So what does that mean? What does Superman style ability mean? What is one of the problems? So there's an aspect that Superman shares with D&D characters, especially high-level D&D characters. And one of the problems that often comes up in a lot of comic book hero kind of things, but specifically with Superman, how do you threaten Superman? The guy's basically impervious. Outside of his, like, one weakness of kryptonite, an eclipse, I guess, from the sun, because he derives his power from the sun. How do you threaten a guy that's basically bulletproof, has X-ray vision, laser eyes, can faster than a spinning train, flies over buildings, right? So overpowered compared to anything that they really deal with for the most part, at least human-wise. That's why you have all those sort of like extraterrestrial threats often for Superman. But how do you threaten that? And that's the same thing that we deal with sometimes, especially when we get into higher level play. It's that how do you threaten the player characters when they're so powerful? They're so powerful. It's more of a Spider-Man. It's used most effectively, I feel like, for Spider-Man. Is that you attack the things around them. Your villainy is about attacking around them. No, the solution we're looking at here is we need to attack what's important to them that's not them. You know, what are their favorite NPCs? What are their safe havens, their strongholds, their patrons, etc. This, like, if you want to see the most clear, probably pop culture example of that as far as D&D is concerned, it's the introduction of the Chroma Conclave in the first campaign of Critical Role. Absolutely comes in, absolutely rips through Tal'Dorei, starts killing off powerful NPCs that are and threatening the party's friends and the place that they thought they were safe and all that stuff. They're attacking around the party rather than really the party themselves. I mean, they do have a fight, but right, it's really about attacking what's around them, being like, there's never going to be a safe place for you. Your patrons are gone. I'm attacking your strongholds when you're not there, because at the end of the day, especially with a D&D party, they can only be in one place at one time. And if that place isn't where the villain is, the villain's somewhere else, right? Your big bad evil guys are somewhere else doing something else, if they're not fighting the players. So there can be a lot of cat and mouse. There can be a lot of, very sort of mustache twirling evilness, where you're like, oh, well, I've taken your favorite grung bad guy that you turned into basically like the party's favorite NPC. Well, I've stolen them and tied them to the railroad tracks. You best come save them. Hamstringing them into an adventure and be like, hey, well, if you try to do anything bad to me, well, I'll just kill your friend. How about that? Give me what I want. And you're kind of adding these more sort of moral dilemmas to them, because that's more effective sometimes than being like, hey, I'm just going to send assassins at these high-level characters in the night, which is another way to do that, right? It kind of goes back in. Now, that gets, Superman-style villainy gets beyond sort of the specifics of individual encounter building. But you're setting up different stakes. We're talking about, right, this deals with all of this. Monster strategy, we're doing this specifically because we're dealing with adventure tiers and action economy and things that, once we get into higher level play, it's really, really difficult to start challenging the players, and we have a much smaller roster of monsters we can effectively kind of use against them. They have a different strategy, right? They're trying to do something. They're not just stealing. They didn't just steal your grung friend just to steal your grung friend. It's because they want something from the party, right? Or they want the party to not be at a specific place at a specific time. So if we steal your grung friend and then tell you to come rescue your grung friend, and while you're doing that, we're doing some other sort of devilish villainy thing because you weren't in the place protecting the thing you were supposed to be protecting, and now now the villains got one up on you because they were smart. Environmental use, right? There's gonna be a lot of that. If we pick maybe all, for whatever reason, the entire party's immune to poison, well, I'm still going to take one of your valuable NPCs, or suffuse your stronghold with poison. Like if there's a cloud kill kind of thing that rolls through your stronghold, and the player characters wake up to find that they're perfectly fine, but everybody else who was in the stronghold got killed by the cloud kill poison gas during the night. And you're like, oh no, now that's right. Again, mustache curling, like super evil villain, like, ha ha ha. You may be safe from me, but your friends are not. Monster pick and mix, yeah, very same thing. We're gonna set up very specific things. This is when we start to dial in things where we talk about the parties having very specific strengths and weaknesses. So when you start being like, hey, even high level characters kind of suck in the water, or when they have to do aerial combat. So doing things like that, the pick and mix. Variable difficulty, well, we're always going to be doing that. Monster motivations, right? We have very specific things that we're trying to do. Whether that's kidnapping them, or maybe we're sneaking in and stealing their prized gear, or something like that. Again, we're hitting the PCs where it hurts. Especially at very high levels, we're no longer, as Dungeon Masters, particularly interested in doing straight hit point damage to party members. You're talking about when hit points are into the triple digits, what's the point of going after hit points? Like, you're much more likely to kill a player character or put them in severe peril by giving them exhaustion levels at that point, or taking stat damage or things like that. Things that make them worse really seep at their power, because that's another problem, especially with Dungeons and Dragons and its, let's say, complementary games, is that you're still as effective at maximum hit points as you are as one hit point. It doesn't have a sort of death spiral like a lot of other games do. And because of that, you need to hit them where it hurts. You need to put them in a position where they're not as capable as once they were, because that's going to make them feel a lot more threatened than just taking off a portion of their hit points, a fraction of their hit points, one swipe at a time. Clever play ideas, right? Remember, the monsters can do that too. This is when you have your kryptonite, your Lex Luthor kryptonite gun or whatever. That sort of thing happens to their clever play. You have a very specific thing that deals with that. Maybe you have somebody who runs up to that paladin who's got some sort of like vial bolt. There's like a syringer bolt that you could stick into and injects them with some sort of like demonic essence, and now that they have to roll to, be able to channel their holiness, because now they have some sort of unholy thing that's inside of them that doesn't make it a 100% chance that they're going to be able to channel their power for smites. It'd be like, I'm going to do a smite on this character. It's like, all right, but you got to roll it may not be very difficult. Maybe it's like a 13 plus charisma check to be able to channel that. Like, I failed it. All right, you failed it, and you're still going to use one of those spell slots. Like, you still expended the spell slot, just to really kind of like give them that pinch sometimes. Not always, but to give them that pinch to be like, man, this really highlighted one of my very specific strengths and made it a weakness. And now I kind of suck at it, and I'm really going to have to rely on my friends to get me through this one. So that sort of stuff. So you can see like all these levels interplay with each other so much. They're so enmeshed. And when you start doing that, and you start getting beyond just the rules as words on the page and take it to be something more, to be cool, to be interesting, to do stuff that player characters are not prepared for, players haven't seen before, they haven't dealt with, to keep them on their toes. In the game combats, especially when you do all this stuff together, they don't get stale, right? There's always something new, there's always something exciting that's going on, there's always some new danger, new thing that's exciting them, maybe that they get to real high moments of things where they get to do real cool stuff, and it's high fives all around stuff. Sometimes where it's like, we really screwed up that combat, and we really screwed the pooch on this one, and now our grung NPC is dead, and now we must take vengeance on the villain. Right, and we set up our mustache twirling villain very well for a higher level party to go after. But, maybe the difficulty of having that higher level villain for the party is not necessarily because they're difficult to defeat in combat. Maybe it's trying to get into combat with them. Like, that's the difficulty. You want to talk about trying to stop the combat escalation? If you have a bunch of characters who are tied for steamrolling combat, and then you start being like, yeah, it'd be great, you could probably kill this villain if you could find him, but none of you guys took any sort of like investigation stuff. You didn't take any scrying spells. That person's just in the wind, man. They could be anywhere doing anything. Like, none of your friends are safe, right? We go down here with the Superman style villainy. None of your friends are safe. None of your safe havens are safe. They're no longer havens. Your villain could pop out anywhere. Maybe they're extraplanar, maybe they can teleport, they can move all over the place, dimensional shift. They could be anywhere doing anything at any time. Like, they are a terrifying foe, not because they are particularly powerful combat-wise, but because of their ability to not be caught, basically. To not be pinned down. And their ability to sort of cleverly get what they want. These are the things that we talk about. This is sort of how to take your combats from, hey, I went into Kobold Fight Club or the D&D Beyond Encounter Generator and came up with a combat for my second level party that's 7 goblins or whatever it is. So, good there. Done. Right? And then you go from wondering like, man, that combat was just really flat. Like, it really wasn't that interesting. The fighter just ran at them and just kind of held them there, and then they kind of used a bunch of cantrips on them, and it wasn't really a very fulfilling combat. It wasn't really interesting. Nobody really had to think about it. Then you start layering all this other stuff in here, and then you get all the way up to the last point and be like, with the Superman style villainy, and your players are just hoping for the opportunity to be able to use one of their combat encounters, one of their combat abilities or big level spells on a bad guy. They're just hoping that that opportunity presents itself for them to do that. And then we have all this other stuff where they're using the environment to fight the player characters. They have different motivations. You can talk to the monsters. The monsters, you can parlay with them. You can bribe them. You guys can have a negotiation. You can pay each other off. They can knock you out and drag you back and ransom you. You can ransom them if you can figure out how to do that. Maybe you knock out a couple bugbears. Maybe you get that bugbear ambush. It happens. You knock out the bugbears. You drag them back, and you send a missive to their hobgoblin commander, be like, hey, we'll sell your boys back if you want. And maybe they do, maybe they don't, maybe they have that money. Maybe there's some other sort of thing that happens. Maybe negotiations break down and it's a totally other fight that happens. Maybe it's, right, maybe you're basically kind of stringing two fights together at that point because you have these two bugbears that aren't considered part of the fight, and then they break their bonds and they get into the fight from behind the player characters. And maybe that's where the wizard or the cleric is, and they lock them down and grapple them down and kick their holy symbols out of their hands and rip the wizard's book out of their hand and fling it across the room into a pond or something like that and make the wizard useless, and doing all this sort of like fun asymmetrical fight where everything's really dynamic and people are doing other things other than I run up to the guy and I hit him with my sword until one of us falls over. That's the last thing that we want to try to do with this. So all of this kind of rushes in to basically do that. Is basically bring us to a point where none of our combat should be run up to the guy, hit him with the sticks until one of us falls down. That's the one thing that we're trying to basically avoid. We want to make dynamic, fun encounters. So when you have this many sort of like options, this many sort of dials to help you adjust your encounters, when you're planning and running, you're going to find it much easier to just dial in the right level of danger, especially for homebrew adventures, and you can use the techniques to alter and improve published adventures you run. Because a lot of published adventures kind of have boring combats most of the time. So you can use these to kind of like zhuzh them up, right? You can hit them with that spice, sprinkle in that heat, that spice, to really make it different. And so we've listed out a bunch of stuff, a bunch of dials, different things you can kind of change. The one thing that's really, really important is that you don't try to do all of these at the same time. Naturally, they're going to, like, even as I'm doing the examples, you can see that they naturally sort of, like, fold into each other. But this is not a situation where the more things you stuff into it, objectively, the better the combat's going to be. If you put in too much stuff, you're really going to slow down combats because it's going to be really slow. You're going to have to carry so much in your head. You're going to have, like, an entire page sheet of notes for one fight, and that's not helpful for us, and it's not going to be helpful for your players. Just like, no, you just kind of like pull things here as they make sense. They'll organically kind of mesh together. As you practice these things, experience is going to tell you when you're looking through it and you're thinking about it and you're forecasting, imagining how the fight's going to go in your mind, and be like, okay, this is how they standardly deal with things. So they're going to rush in and do this. Okay, and then they'll just bowl over the bad guys there. Then maybe I need to add something else that's going to inject something else that's going to kind of put them off kilter. And doing those sorts of things. So you're like, oh, well, maybe I need to change up the terrain, or maybe I want to have some sort of specific hazard that's going to be detrimental to them, but not detrimental to the monsters. It kind of gets your gears churning in that way. But I think that's everything. That wraps up everything I wanted to do. So if you guys have any ideas, make sure to throw them down in the comments of this video. I'll take a look at them, whether that's questions or ideas of other stuff you want to see. I know I had somebody throw in a comment very recently that they wanted to check out, wanted me to check out sort of the 2d6 biome variation table and messing with that, so I might do that in a future one. You're currently running a 5e campaign converted from Pathfinder. Players are 14th level now, and the combats have turned into cakewalks, so I'm throwing everything I can at them, starting over. Yeah, I mean, the truth is that, and I think you've come across this experience, and that's been my experience, and I think most DMs' experiences, we get frustrated because adding more difficult monsters doesn't necessarily make the combat more difficult. Right? Higher ACs, harder to hit, dealing more damage, better saves, more hit points, those don't make the combats any more interesting. So yeah, I think if you follow some of these things, suffice it to say that I have never had the problem that a lot of DMs do, where they really struggle to challenge parties. I almost always have, if I'm going to have an issue with it, I have the opposite issue, like I had with the goblin fighting. encounter where it was an easy encounter that ended up in a TPK. I tend to have the opposite encounter where I will tune a combat that I think is relatively okay, and then it'll end up steamrolling the party. That tends to be my experience, not the other way around. So you try to hit the middle ground, but it's always so much of the difficulty of an encounter is dependent on how tactical the players are and how well they play with each other. So if you have a very tactical party who's very power gamey, who really have a lot of this, right? They have a lot of the pick and mix team symbiosis, where they have a lot of stuff that works together, and they have really good things where they can lock things down. But anything you can do, think about their standard operating procedure. Okay, a fight happens. What does this character do in the first 2 rounds of combat? Because they probably do the same thing most of the times, again and again and again. Put obstructions that keep that from being as useful. So things like that will really go a long ways. And especially if that's not just like adding monsters, but adding some other sort of more loosely defined difficulty or challenge in a combat encounter is very helpful. But yeah, that's thanks for coming along with me, guys. That's everything I want to talk about in this one. We're just filling it out. Again, if you didn't watch the first video, which covers these first 2 levels, which are really the more foundational levels, especially if you're new to the game or new to DMing or new to specifically doing homebrew adventures and things like that, where you have to build your own encounters. Those are definitely the ones you want to pull into first, because everything else that we just talked about kind of bases off you having this basic understanding of things. Doing things like morale and monster strategies, and understanding the encounter building tiddly bits, like the little noodly bits. The environmental use, and using monsters and arenas that work together, and doing the variable difficulties and monster motivation. But thanks for coming along with me, guys. This will be up, so if you haven't had a chance to watch this or the first one, you'll have plenty of opportunities to watch it. Make sure to like the video and if you haven't gone back, please go ahead and drop a little subscription, right? That's always helpful for us if you want to check out the channel and the other things we talk about. I also have a solo RPG series that I do on streams. We'll probably be hitting that back next weekend, same time. And I'll be doing that. I don't even know what session we are there. Maybe 36 in the solo RPG. And so if you want some more interesting information about watching me basically actively improvise running a game that I'm playing in at the same time, which is very interesting, check that out, and you can see me how I use some of the random encounters, use some of the stuff, because you'll find it very often that I end up using things like cover and other things that don't often come up a whole ton. But yeah. Oh, your players don't enjoy combat encounters if they are easy. Yeah, that's a systemic issue. That's the same issue. I watched a video very recently about Skyrim, where somebody's going through Skyrim talking about how the stealth archer was inevitable. And there's a very good video game design adage, whatever you want to call it. It's about, given the opportunity, players will optimize the fun out of a game. If you have combat encounters, they will optimize themselves to the point where the combat encounters feel like cakewalks. And then they get upset about the combats being easy. And it's like, because you chose a very specific path to make them easy. So we have to do a lot of work sort of in the background as Dungeon Master to be like, okay, and that's the same thing that they do in video game design, to be like, okay, we have to do mix-ups. We have to introduce something new, something different that's not going to allow you to do that one optimal thing that you always try to do. Yeah, everybody does the stealth archer in Skyrim. Like, everybody plays that way. And the video goes into it, like, how the mechanics drive people to that. And you're like, oh, yeah, no, that totally makes sense, because it's one of the aspects of the game where it has much more scalable damage, and then you get all the bonuses for stealth on top of that. And so it makes it easier to stealth. Like, there's a reason why it's like the default mode of play for Skyrim. And even if you're trying to do something else, at some point you're gonna kind of push yourself towards that. It's because the mechanics of the game reward it. The nice thing about being a Dungeon Master, playing a game that has sort of a human that's behind the screen doing and being able to actively change and react to how the players engage with the game, is that we can do things and be like, okay, well, we need to put in more situations where stealth archery doesn't work. So creatures that have tremor sense or other things, or well-lit places where there's nothing to hide behind, those sorts of things where you can't stealth, or reduce sight lines, so you need to reduce not necessarily the size of a arena that you're fighting in, but you need to reduce like being able to see from one end of it to the other. So you need chest high walls and all sorts of pillars and things that are obstruct things. Maybe there's smoke and fire and trees and mist and fog, and now archery's not as useful because you can't really see. Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, use the stone golems. So you want to change the stone golems to where only mundane weapons will harm them. That'll be interesting. And the only thing that I would consider is like, what are your spellcasters going to do in that fight? Depending on what you're playing, but if you're playing like an OSE, OSR thing, then your wizards or whatever probably have crossbows on them. But in something like a 5th edition game, they probably don't have a lot of ranged mundane weapons. Well, any wizard that's probably doesn't have a death wish isn't going to run into melee with a with a giant stone golem. Yeah, so the spellcasters will be stumped. I would advise one of the things you want to look at is not making them completely useless. So find some way to, like I said, use these. If you want to use, where's it at? Use this. Focus on this for the spellcasters. Kind of push them towards this aspect, that facilitating clever play ideas. Have them be able to like use their spells like shatter or other spells or other things that they can do, summons or things like that that they can bring to the fight that will do mundane damage. The ability to use shatter on like a pillar and knock a pillar over on top of the golem or something like that. Give them ways that they can use their magic, but they can't use it like direct. Like, you can't directly damage this foe, so you have to come up with like a clever way, and I'm going to build some options for you. Like, if you want to use something like catapult or something like that and be like, yeah, catapult just does mundane damage. You can just throw rocks at this thing at 3d6. You can do that. Like, give them these things, but like magic damage by itself, it seems completely immune to. You do want to avoid a situation where a character's just like I had with the library shelf example, where it's like I couldn't push, the DM didn't let me push the library shelf try to push the library shelf over onto the bad guy, but there was no other way for me to get the bad guy or see through the bookshelves or have anything else to do basically on my turn that felt productive. And so you want to give them the ability to be productive. They're just going to be like, you have to be kind of clever here. You have to use your environment and do stuff like that. And when they do stuff like that, and you start adding that, and especially when you start adding things like the bad guys can also do those same things. Like, there's no reason that the golem can't shoulder rush a pillar and knock it over onto the fighter, and now the fighter's pinned under it, and everybody else needs to go over there and use like the aid action to help try to pull the pillar off the fighter or something like that. Oh, the guy who plays the Warlock Sorcerer in your campaign is a genius. He'll probably figure that out. Yeah, I mean, I think make it as clear as possible up front. Get around the spells in, and you guys are like, well, it doesn't seem like your spells affect this thing at all. Like, you see the magic bounce off of it. Make it clear that the different magic they do, very, very upfront, right? Very much telegraph, so they don't waste like 3 rounds of trying to do direct damage spells on it. That's the only thing you want to avoid. You want to avoid them feeling like they're not being productive in the encounter in any way. That's really the only thing you need to worry about, I think, with that encounter. And so make sure that there's plenty of ways that what they can do to aid other people that's not like run and then try to do stabs or whatever as a wizard with their crappy little D4 dagger and then get backhanded by Golem and KO'd immediately. But yeah, I think I'm going to call it there. Thanks for coming with me, guys. Hope you guys had a lot of fun. Hope this was really interesting. Make sure to go and watch the first video if you haven't done that. Subscribe. We'll do more of this stuff all the time. Check it out. We also have a blog, reddragonfiend.com, that has more of this kind of stuff if you want to get really in-depth on a bunch of stuff. Got a lot of stuff there. Mostly DM-focused, but also some player-focused stuff there. And world-building stuff. So if you're interested in any of that, we have a big world-building series we've been working on over there. So check that out. We do have some things on Drive-Thru-RPG. Still Red Dragon Fiend. Check that out. Social media, I'm on sometimes. I'm really bad about it. But you can always follow me over on Twitter, or X, I guess now. And that's the easier way to do it. It's Red Dragon Fiend also. And otherwise, stay tuned. We'll have more of this stuff coming out lately. And I'll see you guys next time. Alright? Bye!